National Treasury officials, chairpersons of the portfolio committees on finances from provinces, both in the sitting and on the hybrid or on the virtual platform, members of the public, all stakeholders that might be in attendance, and the support staff of all the 4 committees on finance of Parliament. A very good morning to you and welcome to the meeting. We are not going to make any opening remarks. I am with the 4 chairpersons of committees on finance. At my far left is Honorable Maimane, the chairperson on the Standing Committee on Appropriations from the National Assembly. And then next to him is Dr. Maswangani, a Standing Committee on Finance chairperson from the National Assembly. Next to me is Honorable Ndlovu, a chairperson on the Select Committee on Finance, and myself, Honorable Lekwase, a chairperson on the Select Committee on Appropriations. Both of us are from the NCOP. I am not going to take long in opening the meeting. We have a long engagement today with the Minister, and our intention is to be mindful of time, as our meeting has been set for 3 hours, which is from 10 o'clock until 1 o'clock. I am going to request that we do not take any round of introductions, as there's many of us. Anybody who make a submission or asks the question, they will introduce themselves during the deliberations. Welcome again into the meeting. This meeting will be focusing only on the briefing by the Minister of Finance on the 2025 budget that he has tabled before Parliament on the 12th of March. I will therefore, without any waste of time, hand over to the Minister to lead the presentation, and he will indicate on how the team from the National Treasury will be taking us through the presentations. And then later I will allow members to engage on the presentation, ask questions, and make any comments they might want to make towards the presentation on the budget, and then we'll take it from there. Thank you very much. Over to you, Minister.
Thank you, chairpersons of the NCOP, Appropriation, and SCOF. Thank you for the opportunity to find the time to, I'm going to ask the DG to take us through, but I want to make some few comments. The first one, with challenges as a nation, part of those challenges is the erosion and the capacity of our social service to be able to meet the needs, particularly of our poor communities. We make the point, for instance, in the respect to health, that just between March and December last year, we lost roughly about 9,000 professionals. And those professional positions could not be filled. We're going to another year where we should be employing more professionals. What this budget is attempting is to grapple with that question. You will be aware that we've had doctors, unemployed doctors, marching to everybody's office. The last march was to my office. Expressing a need to provide this needed service to our communities. It's not about employment, it's about to provide a service which is needed to our communities. The health budget had been so eroded, as I indicated, that the accruals amounted to 21 billion rand. Now, if all of us here as honorable members, we care about these poor communities whose services have been eroded, it's going to be important that irrespective of where we stand on a number of things, we keep our eyes on the ball. And so how do we address that issue? It may well be from a different eye, we have not addressed it. As long as the debate is going to be, we must be addressing these needs of our people, but how do the key question, how? We may have taken a route which, in these circumstances, colleagues may differ. A tax raising taxes. The similar exercise in education. If you live in KZN, you must know that already KZN was intending to march to protect existing teachers. We may disagree, colleagues, I'm telling you, about methodologies and other things, but I don't think we'll disagree on the substantive nature of what we're attempting to resolve. Our defense force lack of funding became clear during the DRC problem. We can't continue in that way. I'm citing but a few examples of what we're trying to grapple with, colleagues. Poor communities use communitary. One of the things we're doing in this budget is to invest much, particularly on signaling, to reduce the time for the train. For poor communities, we make this thing in the statement that if you are in Naledi now, you will have a train in every 10 minutes. If you are in Khayelitsha, you will have a train in every 10 minutes. That's our ambition. And I made the point that the World Bank study shows that one of the difference between your rand for rand, a South African worker and a South Korean worker, the difference in terms of disposable income is because the South African worker pays a lot on transport. So I thought I should make those remarks as far as the DG is going to present to understand where we are heading to. We may be taking a wrong direction but we might understand where we're heading to. That's what we want members to appreciate. Thank you very much. DG.
Thank you very much. Over to you, DG.
Thank you, Honourable Chairs. Good morning to you and the Honourable Members and all the colleagues here today. My name is Duncan Peters. I'm the DG of the Treasury. The presentation, as the Minister has indicated, sets out a budget that we believe is a budget that sets the scene for us to be able to invest in the right kind of things for faster growth. So we always start this presentation with the economic outlook. We'll talk about how the various strategic investments in infrastructure can support job creation and growth. We will also then indicate what all of this means for the fiscal framework, and then, of course, articulate the decisions that are being taken on the tax and the spending side and what that then means for the fiscal framework. The next slide shows the global growth outlook. We always start putting together a fiscal framework with our macroeconomic forecast, and the starting point of that forecast is what's going to happen to global growth. So in the near term, we expect global growth to remain stable at 3.3%, which is below the historical average. And there are quite significant regional differences. In the US, for example, they are experiencing upward revisions to growth, while in the euro area, they are challenging with growth because of their own geopolitical tensions as well as the broader global uncertainty. Inflation has continued to ease, but in many parts of the developed world in particular, structural constraints such as low productivity and aging populations limit their long-term growth potential. On the next slide, we go into the South African forecast for growth. We project growth of 1.9% in 2025 from a revised estimate of 0.6% in 2024. This growth does reflect weaker than expected GDP outcomes in both the third and the fourth quarters. We expect growth to average 1.8% from 2025 to 2027. Household consumption has been revised lower, while gross fixed capital formation or investment and government consumption is revised higher. We will, of course, also incorporate in future growth forecasts the outcome of the fourth quarter GDP numbers, which were released a week before we tabled the budget. The next slide then just outlines the risks. On the domestic side, logistics challenges remain a constraint. There are some unfunded spending pressures that we are concerned about. In particular, the Minister would have spoken in previous engagements around things like PEPFAR, which have not entered the fiscal framework yet, as it were. Faster than expected easing in interest rates and inflation is an upside risk, potentially, because that would boost consumer spending. There are some potential also positive upside risks from domestic food prices that could benefit from a recovery there. And on the revenue side, greater than anticipated withdrawals from two-pot retirement would lead to higher than anticipated levels of both consumption and revenue. On the global side, there are heightened concerns over escalating protectionist risks and geopolitical tensions and what that means for global growth as well as commodity prices. A strong US dollar may cause capital outflows, although, interestingly, the rand remains one of the best performing emerging market currencies against the dollar, which of course for us helps because it limits imported inflation and therefore keeps prices in South Africa lower. There are some limited upside risks globally also from the implementation of structural reforms in other parts of the world. The next slide then outlines our medium-term economic strategy, which is anchored by 4 pillars or 4 priorities. First, maintaining macroeconomic stability and reducing volatility to reduce the cost of living and encourage investment. How? Because if you have macroeconomic stability in place, you will benefit from lower interest rates and therefore lower cost of capital and lower cost of borrowing, which supports investment. Implementing structural reforms is the second pillar and remains important in order to promote a competitive economy while addressing the various constraints to job creation. Building state capability is a very important priority, in particular for Operation Vulindlela Phase 2, which will focus, amongst other things, on digital transformation. And then finally, and the slides will talk to this in greater detail, infrastructure investment, and we'll return to that later. The next slide then just summarizes the one key pillar of the growth agenda, which is structural reforms. In phase 2 of Operation Vulindlela, we will be following through on some of the existing reforms in electricity and logistics in particular. But there are also some new priorities for phase 2. On the local government side, institutional governance and financial reforms to address the root causes of deteriorating performance and service delivery at a municipal level. On the spatial inequality side, creating dynamic cities through things like resolving the title deeds challenges, resolving some of the land use and permitting related issues, as well as significant investments in commuter rail, which the Minister spoke to earlier. And then on the digital transformation side, there are significant investments in digital public infrastructure that's being planned. On the next slide, we then talk to our fiscal strategy and the key components of that strategy. First, strengthening fiscal sustainability and accountability. The government is committed to ensuring that we have a growing primary budget surplus, which is the budget balance that excludes debt service costs or interest payments, of 0.5% this year, rising to 0.9% in 25-26. And we published a document on fiscal anchors to start a conversation, a broader conversation about how to ensure that we can improve the long-run sustainability of our fiscus. Secondly, on the tax policy side, we are proposing 28 billion rand in additional tax revenue measures in 25-26 and an additional 14 billion in 26-27, and we'll go through those tax measures in detail later. We are also expecting 4 billion rand in revenue from the sale of strategic oil reserves, which will flow into the National Revenue Fund in 25-26. On the infrastructure side, we'll go through that in more detail later, but we are adding or proposing to add 46.7 billion to infrastructure plans. This is a key part of the growth agenda. And then finally, a sustainable public service wage agreement, which will add certainty for the next 3 years due to the 3-year nature of that agreement. Public servants will receive 5.5% wage increase in 25-26, which will exceed inflation, and then CPI-linked increases in the 2 outer years. This wage agreement will cost the government an additional 7.3 billion in 25-26, and then 8.2 billion by 27-28. The next slide then talks to the plans on infrastructure, which is a very important pillar in our view of unlocking growth and job creation because of how labor intensive, in particular, the construction sector is and the very high employment multipliers there. Over the next 3 years, just over 1 trillion is being allocated to public infrastructure, with very large allocations to roads, 402 billion, energy, 220 billion, and water and sanitation, 156 billion over the medium term. And the budget then proposes additional funding of 46.7 billion for infrastructure projects over the medium term. There are also some institutional reforms that are being finalized. We are establishing a single structure in the National Treasury in 25-26 to coordinate state participation in project preparation, planning, PPPs, funding and credit guarantees. We are bringing together various bits of project preparation, capacity support in GTAC, the PPP unit and the DBSA, so that we can strengthen the quality and the depth of the infrastructure pipeline. When we talk to the funders in the infrastructure space, there's a lot of appetite, in particular, from the banks and other financial institutions to invest in infrastructure, but the problem is the project pipeline. On the PPP side, public-private partnerships, the PPP regulations have now been finalized and published and streamlined. and they have reduced approval requirements for projects below 2 billion. We have also established a framework, or we have allowed in these regulations for a framework to be established to process unsolicited PPP proposals or bids from the private sector. A lot of entities have called for that because they don't currently have a way of processing unsolicited bids. And the BFI, the Budget Facility for Infrastructure, has approved a further 9 projects worth 55 billion over the next few years, 15.3 billion of which will be funded by the BFI. We are also this year replacing the 1 BFI window with 4 windows. So we will now be giving departments and entities 4 opportunities per year to submit their projects for funding, and we believe that will really assist with the infrastructure pipeline. And then finally, the budget proposes a performance-based conditional grant for trading services or trading entities at a municipal level that provide basic services such as municipal water. And this grant will incentivize financial and operational reforms to improve the functioning of these entities. Turning now to the first part of the fiscal framework on the next slide, which is the changes in tax policy. The Minister spoke about the various spending pressures in the system, and it is our view that an increase in the spending has to be accompanied by an increase in revenue in order for the government to maintain its commitment to fiscal sustainability, including a rising primary surplus and stabilizing debt in 25-26. The Minister spoke about what some of these are, and while this budget includes a mixture of tax measures, it does still consider that a VAT increase will be indispensable for raising the additional revenue. On the next slide, we talk about what some of those medium-term expenditure adjustments are. The 2025 budget proposes additional spending pressures to be funded of 232 billion over the medium term. And we can see what those additions to baselines are in the table on the slide that's currently being projected. Firstly, about 46 billion, as we indicated earlier, to infrastructure. Secondly, 23.3 billion to fund the wage agreement that was signed a few weeks ago. An additional 11 billion is being proposed for early retirement. There are a number of departments, such as the Department of Defense and Correctional Services, where they cannot afford the current employees on their structures. And so we believe, in consultation with these departments, that making a provision for early retirement without penalties to your pension fund, as well as an incentive for early retirement, will help these departments to readjust their employee budgets and rejuvenate those departments by bringing in new employees. All of the savings that departments will get from early retirement will be retained by those departments, so they will not flow back to the fiscus. And secondly, early retirement is only possible with the permission of the accounting officer or the executive authority. So departments will have the final say in deciding who actually leaves. Another 35 billion rand appropriation is proposed for the Social Relief of Distress Grant. The honourable members will notice that in 26-27 and 27-28, there is no appropriation being proposed for the Social Relief of Distress Grant. But there is, however, a provisional allocation in the fiscal framework for the Social Relief of Distress Grant. So it is funded for the next 3 years. The only reason it's not there is because the second 2 years is a provisional allocation in the fiscal framework, and that's because of the ongoing work around the Social Relief of Distress Grant in terms of determining its future. The budget also proposes above-inflation increases to social grants. So all social grants will be increased by inflation, but there are some above inflation increases that are being proposed, which will cost 8.2 billion. And this is also to offset the impact of the 0.5 percentage points increase in VAT that's being proposed. So, for example, in the case of the old age pension grant, that grant is going up by 130 Rand per month. And in the case of the child support grant, by 30 Rand per month. There are 70 billion rands in provisional allocations for frontline services. Those are the services that the Minister spoke to earlier and will cover on a later slide. And then there are some other spending additions which we'll also cover later. We are offsetting some of these expenditure additions through reductions in provisional allocations. So, for example, the very large reduction in 25-26 in the provisional allocation was a provisional allocation that was put into the budget for the social relief of distress grant. So that is offsetting the 35 billion above the line. And then we are reducing the contingency reserve. So unfortunately, we have much lower buffers in this fiscal framework than we would typically have. We are reducing the contingency reserve by 2.6 billion in 25-26 and almost 10 billion in the outer year. So later on in this presentation, we will take the honourable members through some of the detail of some of these expenditure adjustments. Turning now back to the details on the tax side. On the next slide, we spend a few slides explaining the proposal to Parliament on the VAT rate. So we have considered different options to raise the revenue required in order to cover the expenditure that we have just detailed. We were concerned that increasing personal income tax or corporate income tax would be more negative for employment, savings, investment, and growth than a value-added tax increase. While CIT is imposed on businesses, it is ultimately paid by the people who work there, as well as the shareholders and consumers. And we already have a very high contribution of CIT towards tax revenue. If we look at the second chart, we can see there, relative to the rest of the continent and relative to our OECD peers, corporate income tax as a share of GDP has consistently been much, much higher. However, in contrast, if we compare the VAT rates by country, we can see that the average VAT rate in the OECD countries is around 19%. Ours is currently at 15%, and we can see where some of the other countries fall there as well. On the next slide, we go further to talk about PIT. We do have a very high personal income tax rate as a percent of GDP, as well as a very high top rate at 45%, both of which are much higher than other developing economies, which is what the first chart shows. We also acknowledge, and this has been discussed over the last few weeks, that previous tax rate increases for PIT did not raise the expected revenue, because what taxpayers did was they simply changed their behavior in order to avoid the tax. And in fact, when we increased the top rate to 45%, there was a large reduction in reported taxable income in response to that. Then on the next slide, we talk about what's been done to mitigate the impact of the increase in the VAT rate. The government has proposed direct relief to vulnerable households in the form of above inflation increases to the various social grants. We are also proposing to expand the basket of zero-rated items to include canned vegetables, edible offal, and dairy liquid blends. And however, we do acknowledge that in previous cases, because zero rating is such a blunt tool, the benefits from previous items that were zero rated did not fully pass through to lower income households. But it is clear that the prices did decrease and that there was some benefit, although not fully passed through. And of course, also, there is no proposed increase to the general fuel levy or the road accident fund levy in order to limit the broader impact on cost of living. In the next slide, we just spend a few bullets on the criteria used for VAT zero-rated items additions. The principle that we apply is that we evaluate the requests for zero-rated items against the revenue foregone to the fiscus while keeping an eye on the potential impact on lower-income households. And we focus in particular on the expenditure items that are consumed by the households in expenditure deciles 1 to 4. And we target products that are disproportionately consumed by those households so that we are able to ensure that the maximum benefit of zero rating flows through. And the way we do this is by calculating this equity gain ratio that the slide talks about. So we've proposed some additional items as highlighted in the previous slide, and we believe that these items are well targeted and they will limit the revenue foregone to the fiscus. In total, the additional zero-rated items will cost the fiscus about 2 billion rand per year. The next slide then goes back to articulate some of the details of the spending additions, just to remind ourselves what exactly these tax increases are going to pay for, VAT being one of them. First, as indicated on the infrastructure side, funding of the budget facility for infrastructure Window 8 projects. We are also proposing additional funding for disaster management. There are quite a lot of disaster-related infrastructure backlogs in several provinces that have not been addressed over the last few years, and we are proposing that those disaster-related infrastructure backlogs are addressed, and that as an allocation of 4 billion. The Minister spoke about the additions to PRASA of almost 20 billion over the medium term to deal with signalling. The factory that produces the new trains at the moment has ensured that there are enough new trains on all of the lines, but the challenge is that these trains cannot run often enough to ensure that commuter rail becomes a reliable form of transport. And so the investment in the signalling is what is required to ensure that this takes place. We spoke about the performance grant to turn around trading services in metros. There's a small allocation for the Schools Build program in the Western Cape, as well as a project, Drakenstein project, and then rescheduling of My City, which is rescheduled over the medium term. We spoke about the public service wage agreement, early retirement, social relief of distress, the above inflation increases to social grants, and then there are additional provisional allocations to frontline services, which add up to 70 billion. Provincial education compensation costs and the expansion of early childhood development, which comes to about 30 billion. In health, unemployed doctors, provincial COE and goods and services budgets, 28 billion. In defense and correctional services, additions for compensation of employees. And then in home affairs to strengthen their digitization efforts and employ more individuals.
Order, Chair. Chair,
Who's raising on a point of
Mark Burke from the DA. The Finance Minister is asleep at the wheel again. Could we please ask him to wake up?
It is unfortunate that I'm not going to entertain such point of orders in this meeting. The meeting is going to be in order. The presentation has been made by the DG, and what you need to be concentrating on is on the presentation from the DG. Thank you very much. I'm not going to take another handoff. Point of orders, we are here for a discussion on the budget. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honourable Chair. The final line item there of 3.2 billion over the medium term is for digitization in Home Affairs as well as additional employees in the Border Management Authority. The next slide then talks to additional spending items that were already announced at the time of the MTBPS. At the time of the MTBPS, we announced SARS spending adjustments of 3.5 billion over the medium term. The Minister announced in his speech that an additional 4 billion is being allocated there to bring the total to 7.5 billion. There's public employment programs, additions to SUNRAL for GFIP, the troop deployment in the DRC, various other spending additions, and then direct charges. And these direct charges are additions mainly for injury on duty and post-retirement medical benefits. Returning now to the tax slide, I think we'll skip this slide in the interest of time. It just covers the revisions to gross tax revenue projections over the medium term. I think what's more important is the next slide, which talks to the very specific tax proposals. These tax proposals will raise 28 billion in 25-26, as well as an additional 14.5 billion in 26-27. What are these tax proposals? Firstly, on the direct taxes side, we are proposing not a rate increase in personal income tax, but we are proposing no inflation readjustment to tax brackets. And that raises an additional 18 billion in the first year, rising to 20 billion in the outer year. What we would typically do in every fiscal framework is we would adjust the SARS tax brackets by inflation so that people don't end up in a higher tax bracket only by virtue of getting an inflationary linked salary increase. If we don't do that, which is what we would typically do, we then raise additional personal income tax, but that of course means in effective terms the relevant taxpayers are paying more taxes. We are also proposing no inflation readjustment to medical tax credits, which raises an additional 1.5 billion. On the indirect taxes side, as we've indicated previously, we are proposing a 0.5 percentage point increase in VAT in 25-26, which will raise 13.5 billion up to 15 billion in the outer year, and then an additional 0.5 percentage point increase in VAT in 26-27, which of course won't raise any funding this year, and taking effect in 26-27, it will then raise 15.5 billion. We indicated earlier that the zero-rated items will cost around 2 billion, so we are losing revenue there. There's no adjustment to the fuel levy, and because we always assume an inflationary linked adjustment to the fuel levy, that means we are losing 4 billion. There's some diesel refund relief to primary sectors, mainly agriculture, that costs in 26-27 1 billion rand, and then above inflation increases to excise duties on alcohol and tobacco, which will raise 1 billion. And that brings us to a net impact of 28 billion in 25-26, rising to 46 billion, in 27-28. Just a small point on the personal income tax side. There has been some confusion, including when we've engaged with journalists and economists on the PIT bracket creep relief. There is no inflation readjustment to tax brackets in 25-26, but we assume in this framework that there will be inflation adjustments to tax brackets in 26-27 and 27-28. It's just that the 18 billion from this year flows through over the medium term. So this fiscal framework does assume that next year we will be providing inflationary adjustment to tax brackets. Returning now to the spending side on the next slide, what does that mean? Well, it means that our consolidated spending will increase from 2.4 trillion to 2.8 trillion in 27-28. Learning and culture over the medium term and on a consolidated basis receives the largest share of expenditure at 1.6 trillion. And we've always raised to this House our concern around debt service costs, which is the second largest item of spending over the medium term at 1.3 trillion, followed by social development and health at 941 billion. In terms of expenditure growth, it's important to highlight the first slide there, that payment for capital assets is the fastest growing item over the medium term at 8.1%. And that again is a very important part of this budget and the infrastructure reforms being matched by the growth in infrastructure budgets. The second fastest growing item of spending is debt service costs at 7.1%, and that of course remains a concern for us, which is why it's so important for us to not fund the additional expenditure from additional borrowing. On the next slide, we then show the consolidated budget balance, and the budget deficit is projected to narrow to 3.5% of GDP by 27-28. The revenue next year will be over 2 trillion at 2.2 trillion in 25-26, while expenditure is 2.6 trillion, giving us a budget deficit of 370 billion. And it's that budget deficit that we need to borrow for, in addition to the redemptions that become due, and that puts a lot of pressure on our gross borrowing requirement, which I will return to later. The next slide then shows the division of revenue over the 2025 MTF. 48.4% of nationally raised revenue is allocated to national government, 41.9% to provinces, and 9.7% to local government. We are announcing quite a few conditional grant reforms in this budget as well, which are aimed at streamlining the conditional grant system, combining different conditional grants, enhancing flexibility in the conditional grant system, and ensuring that we get better value for money out of our conditional grants. Conditional grants are quite important because they activate a lot of the infrastructure service delivery and spending. On the next slide then, almost at the end, Honourable Chairs, the gross borrowing requirement is reducing over the 2025 MTF period. In 25-26, the gross borrowing requirement is 3 billion higher than projected, which partly due to a slightly higher budget deficit, but this is offset by a reduction in the Eskom debt relief. The final Eskom debt relief, which was going to be 70 billion rand, has been reduced now to 50 billion rand, saving the taxpayer 20 billion rand in additional funds that would have gone to Eskom. We are now providing Eskom with 40 billion rand in 25-26 to redeem debt that is maturing in April next year, and then another 10 billion for debt that is maturing in May 2028, adding up to the 50 billion, which is lower than the 70 billion initially penciled in. But it is clear that over the medium term, we are reducing the gross borrowing requirement, certainly for the next 2 years, in particular in terms of our domestic long-term loans, which will come down from 345 billion to 323 billion in 26-27. Next slide shows what does all of this mean for gross loan debt. Gross loan debt will peak at 76.2% of GDP, which is higher than the 75.5 anticipated at the time of the MTBPS. But what's very important is that debt to GDP is still peaking in 25-26 as per our commitment in previous budgets. The next slide talks about state-owned companies and some of the challenges there. There are some areas of green shoots. For example, in Eskom, they are making progress on their recovery plan, although on the finances side, there is room for improvement, and their operational performance also requires improvement. Transnet is still struggling with very high debt levels, and in this budget, 2 additional allocations are being made to Transnet for their Ukuvusilela Auto Corridor, as well as their project at the Cape Town Inland Terminal. And we are working with Transnet on other projects that they may want to submit through the BFI process. But in general, we do have some concerns around the potential impact of state-owned companies and their weakness on the fiscal framework, not only in terms of financial support, but also how their operational activities impact, for example, our ability to generate tax revenue. The next slide then just provides a summary of the fiscal strategy, which I won't go through. If the colleague can then just move to the final slide, which I believe should be here, the one after this, which just talks about the process. We have the committees represented here today, of course, know the process much better than we do, but we thought it's also important, including for the public, to remind ourselves that the process will now begin where the Minister of Finance will work with Parliament to process the budget that has been presented today. This process is governed by the Money Bills and Related Matters Act. And of course, the starting point is that the committees will process the fiscal framework to the National Assembly and NCOP within 16 days or as soon as reasonably possible thereafter. And then, depending on whether the committees accept or amend the fiscal framework, there will then be an engagement process with the Minister of Finance and the National Treasury that is set out there. The annexures to the detailed presentation provided sets out the details of that process and covers both the provisions in terms of the PFMA as well as the Money Bills and Related Matters Act. Very importantly, from 1 April onwards, expenditure is governed by Section 29 of the PFMA, which provides for departments to continue spending in the absence of a passed budget up to 45% of last year's allocations for the first 4 months. But this, of course, does impose limits on the ability of departments to spend any new allocations. That is not provided for in Section 29 of the PFMA. I will leave it there, Honourable Chairs and Honourable Members. Minister, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, DG. Minister, any addition before I note the hands of members? Minister, Deputy Minister, any addition before I note the hands from members?
So now you can give an honourable member. I was worried that Honourable Pendleton didn't clap hands when we showed that we were giving Hassas more money.
Thank you, members. I am going to take a round of hands from the House before noting those that are on the platform for any clarity-seeking question or any comment that may be coming from members. I think it would be better for me to go row by row, starting with Honorable Mkonto going down, and then National Treasury will be noting the questions as they are asked, then later respond. Or I don't know if I should say I should take the first row, they respond, take the second row, they respond, or you want a round of questions. It's better if I take all the questions at a go, and then they'll give responses later. Let me take all the questions in the House, they respond, then I'll give those that on the virtual platform. Over to you, Honorable Mkhonto.
Thanks, Chair. Good morning to you, Chair, all the chairs in front there, the Minister and his team, honorable members and colleagues. Chair, my first question will be based on the 28.9 billion allocated to keep 9,300 healthcare workers employed. But in the Minister's opening remarks, he said, we were not able to keep 9,000 healthcare workers. Why was this not done in the first place? Because we all know that we have a dire need of health workers in this country. 800 post-community service doctors. Is this going to address the doctors that we saw protesting in the Eastern Cape and in Mpumalanga, that they are qualified, but our government is saying there are no jobs for them? The basic income grant increase of 24 rand per day, that is below real value compared to the 17 rand per day in 2017. With the average 5% average inflation, are we considering the livelihoods of our people, or is just an increase? Because if inflation, the increases don't take into consideration the inflation in the country, then it means there is no real value for those increases. Chair, the last one, we are having 16.9 million unemployed people in South Africa, and predominantly these are young people, graduates, people expected to start independent life, build families, and contribute meaningfully to the economy of the country. The VAT increase that is being proposed has clear time frames that by this time we'll have a 0.5 increase, by this time another 0.5, and it makes 1%. But we don't get a clear and achievable plan for job creation. We can't increase VAT to the unemployed masses of this country. That will be my question, Chair, as to when is the issue of the unemployed youth going to be addressed, and it also in conjunction with the early retirements that we are expecting departments to approve. The 30,000 people that qualify to take early retirement, are we aware that most of these people are breadwinners because their children are seated at home unemployed? Now we want them to take early retirement. We are increasing another unemployment in the country. The building of state capacity, as long as the EFF has been alluding to this matter to say, as long as we are with the tender system, there is no way the building of state capacity is feasible in this country. Engineers and other critical skills are leaving the country because they have realized that they have nothing to contribute to this country. all the infrastructure development that is mentioned here will be given to tenderpreneurs. So, exactly how are we going to build the state capacity and be able to be able to provide for our people if critical skills are leaving, people with critical skills are leaving this country, because we have nothing to offer them. Thank you.
Honorable Sibisa.
Thank you, Chair. Greetings to all the chairpersons. Greetings, Minister, and your team. It's very disappointing, Minister, that you try to justify the increase of VAT in this book to say that at least South Africa, your VAT rate is very low compared to other countries. So I'm going to give you a scenario, Minister. South Africa versus Sweden. Population of Sweden is 10 million at 10.4% unemployment rate. Population of South Africa is 64.5 million at 33.2% unemployment rate. So we can't just say that at least you are better, your VAT is lower than, and then you don't take into consideration the population and the unemployment rate. Because again, you are saying that we must be grateful that we do not increase the personal income tax, but in reality, it means that the taxpayer is not exonerated from paying tax because it's coming via the increase of the VAT. So there's nothing miraculous about not increasing the personal income tax. There's nothing special about saying that we are increasing the list of non-zero VAT items. Because again, those unemployed, 33.2% people are not exonerated from paying tax one way or the other, whether it's the non-zero VAT items or is the VAT items, they are going to contribute towards the tax in South Africa. So at this moment, Minister, we should be speaking about job creations. We should be speaking about how are we going to sustain South Africa. And in none of everything that you have spoken, is there any way where it's spoken about job creations? How this whole thing is going to affect South Africans? Implications and how does the increase in VAT affect South Africans? It's as long as we don't have job creations, Minister, as long as we don't have means of getting our people to be employed, there's no solution that's going to happen, because even all the money that you've spoken about, it means that we'll have to go and borrow money somewhere. There's no money in South Africa, and that whole thing is going to affect South Africans. Now, Minister, my question would be, what plans do you have, or what are we going to do, or what industries does the Treasury believe will generate jobs? If the government is actively stimulating local industries, we go to your local economy, we've got tons and numbers and thousands of tuck shops that are being run. And most of those tuck shops, people are buying with cash, which means that there's a possibility that these people do not actually bank the money. Including that, the same unemployed people in townships are being charged the extra money when they go and buy at these tuck shops if they are going to use their cards. And they are also being charged more. They don't have money. Some of these people are relying on the social grants. So we need to be speaking about which industry is the National Treasury willing or on the verge of reviving to ensure that there is employment in South Africa, especially as my colleague has alluded, especially looking to the young graduates that are sitting at home. It's very heartbreaking, Minister, when you go on social media, you find a graduate wearing a gown, posting her qualifications to say, anybody that's got employment, please, can you take my details and refer me to the right people to do that? Us getting into private partnership is not going to assist anything. I'm sitting here and I think that TG will maybe touch on that. What was the deal between Sun Express and South African Airways? And how is that going to assist? Because according to this report, there's no quarterly reports when it comes to SAA. Thank you very much.
Yeah, honorable members, I'm going to request to each spend 5 minutes in asking your questions. So, Honorable Des.
Chair, I just got some feedback from the masses that we represent here. Apparently, they have stopped flighting or showing this important parliamentary activity. So could you please attend to that before we are blamed for looking for audition? I think it's important that our people should be following how we are representing them here.
It's not us. We are
No,
like
it's
you.
It's not you.
I think the issue is noted. They will take it up. Honorable Mautwe, you can make your input.
Thank you very much, House Chair. It's a concern that when we start engaging on the budget, then we get cut off. It's a matter that should not be taken light because we represent constituencies and they want to know what we are saying because they've sent us to come here. Chair, let me start by making it categorically clear that we reject this proposal by the Minister. But because it's in our hands now, it's no longer your proposal. You made your proposal, it's now in the hands of Parliament, which is what we're engaging it. And just to remind you, your party did not get the majority. So there's no rubber stamping here, Minister. We're going to engage it. We're going to have to find each other within 3 months. Because we've got 3 months to pass this budget. Otherwise, we don't have a problem going back to re-election. Anyway, having said that, Chair, you know the issue about the VAT, Minister, you take it very light and you think that, yeah, well, we move from 2% to 1%, which is in 2 years. But the reality is that our people are saying, how are we going to afford to take our kids to school? How are we going to afford to buy bread? And DG, you can't compare us, I agree with Honorable Sibisi, you can't compare us with OECD countries. Because a typical example, Botswana. Botswana gets fuel from South Africa. But as soon as it crosses the border, it's much cheaper. Actually, nice. I stay in the border of Botswana and South Africa. It's better for me to go and refill my car in Botswana than here in South Africa. Why? Because they don't pay the tax, the fuel levy. I have to pay the fuel levy. Their VAT is 14%. Mine is 15% going into 16%. Their income tax, Minister, is 25%. Mine is 45%. So it's disingenuous, really, to compare. And the list goes on and on. I can speak the whole day about these countries that you have listed here. So you can't say you did not increase it and therefore you only increase it. You've effectively increased the personal income tax. Petrol today is 22 rands. Let's look at it 3 months down the line, how much it's going to be. The price of bread. Let's look at, so you need to say the implications of us increasing this VAT will be felt by the same people that we are saying we're protecting them from the personal income tax. And you are not touching on the corporate tax, Minister. It was 29% previously. It was reduced by your own government to 27%. Why is it difficult for you to take it back to 29%? What is it that you are protecting so much on the corporate tax? Because And SARS, that's where it comes in. This corporate tax has gone down. Yes, we agree that there hasn't been a lot of economic activities and companies are not doing well. But what about illicit financial flows? What about tax avoidance? What are we going to do to get these monies out from these companies that are avoiding tax and that are causing you, the SARS commissioner, not to collect revenue for our people? Chair, this Operation Vulindlela, by the way, Minister, it doesn't matter. You can change the name today and make it Operation Buladitsela. The reality is that it started in 2019. It was introduced in 2019. When you came in 2021, you changed the name to Operation Vulindlela. But it effectively does the same thing. You say you want to create jobs. You say you want to create state capacity, but you are introducing private sector. Even worse, you are saying you want to de-risk project that comes from the private sector. Who's going to bear the burden of that risk of this private sector? Why would your own government have so much faith in the private sector than in your own entities? Look at Transnet as an example. Transnet, not very long ago, by the way, less than 10 years ago, 6 years ago, I was there. We used to move over 200 million tons of cargo per year. Today, Transnet is only recording 150 million tons. What has happened? The bulk commodities still remain the same in the country. The rolling stock still remains the same in the country. The track rail still remains the same in the country. What has changed is management. So why would you think the private sector is going to come and assist Transnet to move cargo back to over 200 million? I see that you are ambitious. You are even saying 250 million tons. It's not going to happen. The issue is not the bulk commodities. The issue is not the railway network. The issue is not the rolling stock. The issue is the people that you have deployed at Transnet. That has got nothing to do with the private sector. Private sector will not bring rolling stock. If anything, what Ramasi is talking about, SAA as an example, you sold the aircrafts only to lease them back at the higher price. So that's exactly what you want to do, even with Transnet, because we are saying the private sector must come in. What are they coming in with? They are not bringing any skills. They are not bringing any roll stock. So what exactly are they going to do? And that's what Operation Vulindlela does in the railway sector, in the energy sector. They are not bringing anything, and you are saying you want to de-risk those projects. It's very wrong, Minister. Now, let's look at briefly. I know the chairperson is going to stop me very soon, which, by the way, it should not be the case, because we can't be limited to 5 minutes when you have spoken, when a minister, for over an hour, and on a budget that is supposed to cater for 62 million people. If it means we have this meeting again for constant engagement, I'm saying we've got 3 months to have this thing. Otherwise, we are actually going to have even more problems. Chair, your foreign borrowing. We are prioritizing your foreign borrowing and not domestic borrowing. Why? And we've said this before. And by the way, the point that we are trying to make is, Minister, there's nothing wrong with borrowing money, but there's everything wrong with borrowing money to pay debt. Borrow money, create revenue-generating projects for you to service that debt and still make more money for you to fund the same people. You spoke about 9,000 employees that were laid off, that you could not keep. So basically you are saying, let's just keep the status quo and let's just continue moving on and hoping for a miracle. No, you should be saying with this budget, we'll be able to bring back those people and get more people, because the reality is that we need more people. We need more nurses, we need more doctors, we need more teachers. And it doesn't help, by the way, Minister, having more teachers, having more money for NSFAS, which is not going to plow back into the economy. What are we saying? Look at the model of China. China realized that we need engineers for us to industrialize and to create factories and whatnot. They sent out students from China all across the world to go and train and become engineers, for them to come and work. What do we do in South Africa? We take NSFAS money, we give it to students to go study. After finishing studying, Chair, they come and stay at home and look at you. That's why 28 million people out of the 62 million people depend on you for SRD. We're saying, let's give this money, but let's create job opportunities so that these students can come and back and plow back into the economy. That's how you grow the economy. I've got a lot to add, Chair, because essentially, we agree that we need to make it work for all of us. We are in a crisis, and this crisis was brought by the former liberation movement. But we are happy that we are here to make a contribution because we want to see this South Africa. We don't have any other home. We don't have the luxury of being called to be refugees in America. This is our home. We have to make it work.
If
Thank
there's
you.
still time, we will get a second round, if the time allows. Thank you very much. Next, honorable member.
Thank you very much, Chair, and to the Minister and to all colleagues and National Treasurer and everyone present here today. My name is Nao Tambo. I'm a member of Parliament deployed by the Economic Freedom Fighters. So I think I must begin by stating that there's a lot of, there's an attempt to create an impression that we must all take collective responsibility for the shortfalls in revenue generation and the challenges facing our economy. And I think it's completely unfair. And I think the first budget speech by the minister, which was unfortunately leaked, as he said, was much more explicit in telling us that the avenues they've exhausted to try to stimulate economic growth, which have failed and which the EFF would told you over the past 10 years would fail. Because in your attempt to ring fence us and corner us into only using an increase to VAT as an option, you mentioned that we cannot continue to pursue the route of budget cuts to critical services, which is essentially austerity, which we warned you against. You mentioned that we cannot continue, and that doesn't even need you to mention, that we cannot continue with the reckless and irresponsible levels of borrowing that we've been pursuing, which, by the way, we see no outputs or productive outcomes of. There's been constant borrowing. We are sitting with this high and ballooning debt service costs today, and accumulated debt, but we don't see the practical and meaningful infrastructure developments that come out of it. And therefore, you also state, and perhaps that's not a fault of yours, or you borrow and then you allocate monies and then they get looted in various sectors of our society. But we can't continue to pursue that route, and that was also approaches that were pursued by National Treasury's planning, which have failed, and now we're sitting with ballooning debt service costs. Now we're left with taxation as an option, and we want to tell you it is also going to be a failure, because taxation cannot stimulate economic growth, and it cannot be your approach to sort of determine how you're going to resolve your expenditure costs. It's not sustainable. So there's no long-term framework of how you're going to generate revenue. And it's as if all of these items are new expenditure items. The social relief distress grant is not a new expenditure item. Health is not a new expenditure item. Education is not a new expenditure item. But you present everything to us as if it is a crisis, because you have exhausted failed mechanisms which you decidedly considered were failed mechanisms which were borrowing and austerity in the past. And now taxation is the last option, and we should say today categorically that it's also going to fail. So all of these projections and presumptions that National Treasury works on do not seem to have long-term thinking in mind as to how the economy is going to be stimulated. And this applies also to your projections around economic growth. They are constantly revised downwards. So I see now it says 1.8%. I'm sure when you present the midterm budget, you're going to tell us it's been revised down from that 1.8%, because that has been the trend over the past couple of years. So the attempt to make us take collective responsibility for National Treasury's incompetency and poor planning is incorrect. And the attempt to make us, to blackmail us into a corner that we all have to take these trade-offs in order for people to receive services, whether it's health or education, it's trade-offs that are consequences of poor fiscal planning. And that poor fiscal planning is not a resultant of collective responsibility of parliamentarians or the people of South Africa. So I needed to state that point. And you continue with these presumptions because Operation Vulindlela presumes that the private sector is going to meaningfully stimulate and grow the economy. You have introduced credit guarantees to them that protects them from risk. You're telling us about global risks where you have to ensure, where people are afraid of global risks which entail fear of protectionist industries or protectionist practices by South Africa, as if we're not supposed to protect our local industries. It's incorrect. So you base your entire fiscal planning on private sector investment when the private sector has proven that it is practicing illicit financial flows, tax avoidance, and profit shifting, and base erosion. So, and then you tell us that we're already transitioning to phase 2 of Operation Vulindlela. Can we get the outcomes of phase 1? We're proceeding to phase 2 of Operation Vulindlela. That is fine. What have been the productive outcomes of phase 1 of Operation Vulindlela? Because it cannot be that you're constantly presenting new presumptions and we must adopt them, and then they end up failing. So let's have National Treasury take responsibility for that. What have been the outcomes of the excessive borrowing that now we're sitting with debt service costs? Tell South Africans, why do we have such high debt service costs, and how has that impacted on their lives productively? We can have debt, we accept that. We accumulated that debt to serve what purpose, and what can our people point to that has alleviated or changed in their lives that has resulted in these high debt service costs? We've cut budgets, and it's not our responsibility. It's the planning of Treasury which was based on austerity. I'm interested on why we continue to call state-owned companies when there seems to be an adopted political policy that we're not going to conduct what you call bailouts. Why do we characterize state-owned companies the same way that we characterize private companies which would require bailouts operating in South Africa? Because if it is a state-owned company, we surely should be exploring possibly year-on-year allocations for developmental purposes to these state-owned entities, because their point of existence should not be profit. Their point of existence is to be able to service our people, provide reliable railway network services, provide reliable water services, provide reliable freight and airway services, provide reliable energy supply and generation. So to characterize them as bailouts is ostensibly create a situation where privatization is the only option, because you're saying you're going to stop providing bailouts to these institutions. So why are they still called state-owned entities? Because they are responsible, they should be part of the fiscal planning of the state on a year-on-year basis if we're seeing the state-owned entities. Otherwise, they've stopped becoming that. They've stopped being that. So
I'm going to request that you start wrapping up.
Yeah, I start by concluding.
No, yes, you must.
Okay, no, it's fine. And I think perhaps the final point I must make is that hopefully we'll get a second bite. 3 hours is not going to be sufficient for us to deliberate on what we're proposing. We can even sit through the weekend if necessary, but 3 hours is extremely insufficient, because the final point, sorry, Chair, the final point is, what is the logic of the equitable share allocations? Surely there should be a pursuing of revising of how we allocate budgets to provinces and municipalities. Municipalities are the cold face of service delivery. So this added layer of administration, which is provinces, why does it get more allocations as opposed to municipalities, which are supposed to be at the cold face of service delivery? I think we're curious about that, and perhaps we should think about reviewing that, and hopefully we'll get a second bite. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Next, Honorable Member.
Minister, Deputy Minister, DG, Commissioner. So, Minister, I have to compliment you on the extra money to SARS. You've spoken about it, but I don't see it in your expenditure. It talks about 3.5 million in the medium term, so the tables haven't been updated. But I want to compliment you because you've listened to me. It's an issue, the very first issue I've raised in government. It stuck out to me like a sore nail that we're leaving so much money on the table. So I compliment you for listening. It's not only a victory for Action SA, but more importantly, a victory for South Africans, the honest paying taxpayers. So I really compliment you, and I do think it can be a game changer. It's now over to the Commissioner and his team, but we back them, and we're grateful for the work they're doing. You know, they collect 90% of our government revenue. If any organization needs to be properly equipped, it's SARS. So I compliment you on that, and I thank you for listening. It's huge, and on behalf of South Africans, thank you. The other thing, too, as a constructive opposition, when things are good, we need to say it's good, and I think the ECD, increased money to ECD, is imperative. I read a study many years ago. World Bank says it's the greatest investment you can do as an ECD. So I think that needs to be acknowledged and say well done on that. And then the other area that I'm going to implore you, Minister, you listened to me last time and I hope you listen to me again, is that I sit on scope and I sit on the Auditor General, and it's patently clear that there's just too much wastage, corruption and incompetence in the system in government departments and entities. It's like a bucket. It's pointless filling the bucket up with water if it's got a massive hole in it, because it's just going to keep running out. And that's what's actually happening at the moment. I mean, in scope of the last couple of weeks, it's been horrific. Just 2 examples is a compensation fund and the UIF fund. Combined revenues of 46 billion. 46 billion. So it's huge amounts of money. They're a cesspool of corruption, incompetence and wastage. The compensation fund has had a disclaimed audit report for 12 years. The first comment the Auditor General says is there is a total breakdown of internal controls, not just a little breakdown, total. So there's so much money going out the door, and I think we wouldn't have to have tax increases if we could cut the leakage. And I'm happy to engage with you and give you some thoughts about it. And if we could ring fence some money And the AG said to her, she was quite exasperated the other day, and I said, what is the one thing you would like to see? And she said she would like to see corrupt officials in orange overalls, because until there's accountability and consequence management, the money will keep going out the back door. So we would like to see money ring-fenced for corruption, disciplinary hearings, and fast-track that. So that is huge. And I know you can't do anything about this, Finance Minister, but they say a fish rots from their head. You know, our cabinet is the most bloated cabinet we've got, and the cabinet ministers live a life of opulence. The Minister of Human Settlement spent one night in overseas, 198,000 for one night's accommodation. That could have built a house for one family for the rest of their lives. So, and if we're asking society to tighten their belts, it must start at the top. We have to lead by example, and I think that's important. We need to clamp down on the international travel and overseas lifestyle, because we can't ask other people to do it. We can't ask ordinary South Africans to tighten their belt when the cabinet is living a life of opulence and luxury lifestyle. Thank you.
I'll be a bit briefer than my colleagues. I've got one question for the Minister and two questions for the officials here. The question to the Minister is, you've stated now that the 2% VAT increase was your idea. And we know that the DG of Treasury at various instances warned you against that. And if that's the case, it seems that you are now acting contrary to the advice of Treasury. And would you then agree with me, Minister, if that is the case, that you're acting contrary to the advice of Treasury, that in fact you have now gone rogue and you are undermining Treasury? My questions to the officials is the following. To the Director General of Treasury. After the last 15 times that you've tried to predict what GDP will look like, you got it wrong 12 out of those 15 times, or 80%. So I'd like to understand from you whether, while this is hard, whether 80% seems to you like a reasonable number to be bad at your job. 80% of the time it seems that you're bad at your job. And if we get this wrong, then it has a knock-on effect on the amount of revenue that we're able to collect. And when we're able to collect less revenue than anticipated, that has a knock-on effect on debt and taxes. So my question is this: if you're bad at your job 80% of the time, what remedial action have you taken? Or the alternative is, you receive political pressure to be overly optimistic about what GDP data might look like in the future. And so I'd like to understand from you, if you're not bad at your job 80% of the time, you and your team, then was there political pressure on you to overestimate GDP growth? A related question on GDP growth is that between the failed budget proposal on the 19th of February and the pseudo-budget proposal earlier this week, you had 1.9% as GDP growth estimated in there. Yet between those two times, we've seen from the latest 2024 data that 0.6% is what was our GDP growth. And we also know that a trade war is now more likely. And we also know that we might lose our AGOA benefits. And if that's the case, I just need to understand whether, in fact, you had included those considerations and done some remodeling to come up with a more realistic than 1.9% GDP growth number. Finally, to the Director General of Treasury, I'd like to understand the following. We read now in the media that there have been multiple expenditure analysis and studies of SOEs and government departments. Will you make publicly available these documents that it seems like neither at SOEs nor at government departments has been acted on, so that we can fulfill our oversight function and see where the inefficiencies are and start eliminating those inefficiencies? Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Next honorable member.
Honourable Minister, good morning. It has not been an easy week for you, and we appreciate that, and we are with you. I want to just share a little bit of my own life story. I've been married 26 years to my wife, bless her soul, keeping up with me. And there's a reason why I'm asking and telling you this. You know, we're in a partnership, and there are a certain set of values that we really, truly, as partners, appreciate and support. And one is that we are both equal in the relationship. The second one is that we are brutally honest. Thirdly, that we have got mutual respect, and that we are very open with each other, and that we communicate when we are not happy. And also that we will allow each other to add value to the process. Honourable Minister, a number of very strong and very valid submissions were made by the DA to you. None of them have got your support. Is it just being defiant, or are you really just want to assist us and let us go together as partners? Because as partners, that is what we expect from you as a Democratic Alliance. And the reason why I'm saying this, and let me refer to a specific matter. It referred to the 1.6, approximately 1.6% that we had to go look for to cut back on a total budget. Only 1.6% of the total budget. But you have not even considered that. You were not even prepared to go and look for that. That leads me to the following questions, and a lot of them is around the expenditure. Are you still prepared to reconsider and relook at the complete structural reform of all the SOEs? There's hundreds of them. And the impact of these SOEs on our budget. When are we going to get to the point that we realize that we are actually throwing money into a big black pit with not getting this, the feedback or the response like we should, and all these SOEs, and a complete structural review? On a procurement spend, when are we expecting a complete reform of procurement value, not just on quantity, but also on quality, and particularly in two areas? The one is particularly around services, and the second one is capital goods. I'm asking you today, Minister, that you would come up with a plan. And I know that you have started with a rollout of the procurement regulation. I'm telling you that's not good enough. We are still paying way over what the average man in the street would be paying for goods and services as a government. That gravy train has to stop, and it has to stop this year. I would like to ask you, have we considered and factored in the matter of the AGOA in this conversation, and what do we see as an end result if something does happen with the withdrawal of the AGOA agreement, and what is your plans around that? The last point, Minister, is the matter of the unions. We keep on paying above salary increases above inflation rate. When are we going to get to the point that the tail stops wagging the dog? Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Honourable Member. The next member may come in.
Thank you to our chairs and to the Finance Minister, Honourable Finance Minister, Honourable DG, thank you very much. The Minister caught my attention with three words in particular. He said, "If we care," and we do care. We do care. And in particular, we care about the millions and millions of South Africans who don't have work, who don't want a grant nearly as much as what they want a job. And if we're going to create jobs for South Africans, we have to get our economy moving. If we don't get our economy moving, we're not going to be creating those jobs. And I'm not talking about 1 or 2%, I'm talking about 5%, I'm talking about 10%, I'm talking about serious growth. And what is it that unlocks that growth? Your own Treasury team will tell you that what's missing is direct private investment. That's what creates sustainable industries that pay jobs, that feed families, that educate children, that lift people out of poverty. That's the missing ingredient. Of course, we do need other things. We certainly need an emphasis on education. There are many other things that government provides that are very important. But if in the trying to provide all of those other things, we're failing at attracting and having the confidence that's necessary for the investment, the direct private investment, we're not going to be creating the jobs, not going to be seeing the growth that we need to see. Now, our document says in various places things like investing for faster growth. And that's great. That's good. That's what we want to see. But just because we say something is a growth budget doesn't mean it is a growth budget. In fact, we formed the GNU and we said our number one priority is going to be inclusive growth and job creation. But saying that doesn't mean it's going to happen. If our policies don't change and if our practices don't change to line up with that primary priority. Now, we have 4 pillars, 4 macroeconomic pillars. I want to submit that there's one that's maybe implied, but it needs to be more explicit, the missing 5th pillar. And I say it's implied because structural reforms could bring this about, but I think we actually need to say that there's a pillar which is called direct private sector investment. And if we focus our attention on that pillar, then we're going to start to unlock the economic growth and we'll start to unlock the job creation that we need. Now, to do that, we have identified some of the roadblocks, like our dismal performance of our ports, the dismal performance of our freight rail. We can see how that affects us, but we need to go behind the question, not assume we know the answers, but ask the question, what is it that's causing the crisis, the low level of direct private investment in South Africa? Why is it? That is a crisis. That is the crisis. We can talk about all the other things, but if we don't solve that problem, we're not going to see this economy grow in a way that creates sustainable jobs. And so we need to look carefully at international competitiveness. How do we make South Africa competitive? We need to look at how much profit is being made by businesses and what are the triggers that are going to cause that profit to be also reinvested. How do we boost domestic savings and so on. And then we need to look at policy decisions in government that are undermining the confidence of investors. We need to look at other things like the expropriation bill. We have a government that feels like it's running in 2 directions at the same time. It makes 1 or 2 good statements and then it moves 2 statements the opposite direction. One moment it's blowing warm towards business and growth and economy and job creation, and another moment it's doing other things which are totally undermining it. Let me just crystallize this with a question because I don't want to go on for longer than my time. But I think it's fair to expect that your econometricians would model tax increases and their effect on GDP. That would be a very responsible thing to do and expected. So what did they find is the effect of a 2% VAT increase on economic growth? And what did they find is the effect of the reduced VAT increase on economic growth? What did they find is the effect of the effective increase in personal income taxes on economic growth? And what did they find is the effect of the VAT increase on inflation? And what did they find is the effect of the VAT increase via the effect on inflation on debt servicing costs? So those 5 things. The effect of the 2% VAT increase on growth, the reduced VAT increase on growth, the personal income tax increase on growth, the effect of the VAT increases on inflation, and the effects on debt servicing costs. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Honourable Member. The next member may come in.
Thank you very much, Chair. In this room, we have many stakeholders that influence and make decisions around tax and the budget for South Africans. And I think South Africans are starting to get tired that they hear the same things over and over again, year in, year out, and their lives are not changing dramatically for the better. You know, you just have to look at the AG's report on the amount of wasteful expenditure, the failed local governments to get their debt in order, and that we really need to start doing things differently in order to stop saying the same things with little to no impact. So today I have two questions, specifically and more succinctly, is that South Africa's debt is sitting in 6 trillion rand at the moment, and we're looking to add to about 400 billion to that this year. So government is probably going to have higher interest rates, and this is further going to suppress our growth, our economic growth. So, and that again is going to constrain the economy and affect people negatively. So what are the plans that Treasury has in place to break this debt, rising debt, and the high rates that we are going to pay, which ultimately is going to affect the economy in a negative way, and we've got to get out of the spiral. And the second question is around the silent tax, and the silent tax is eroding away at South Africans' purchasing power and their economic well-being. And what I mean by this is that we're set to have a tax revenue increase of about 19.5 billion rand in the next financial year. But we haven't adjusted the income tax brackets. So somebody, for example, somebody that may have been earning 8,000 rand in about 2023, and if they had inflation-linked increases, this year they'd probably be earning around 8,900 rand. But the result is that that individual now will be paying income tax, personal income tax. They are now outside the threshold. So this silent tax is going to put more burden on our lower to middle income earners, which exacerbates the cost of living to South Africans. So the question to SARS and Treasury is, what plans do we have to mitigate this silent tax, this fiscal drag that is ultimately going to put direct stress on the most vulnerable South Africans? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Brett.
Thank you very much, Honorable Minister, Director General. Thank you. Honorable Minister, in your opening remarks, you've said that we have an erosion of capacity and that we've lost now 1,000 professionals over the past recent period. Now, deep and hard introspection should be or is needed. We are bleeding jobs. We are not creating it. And this budget is a good starting point to address this issue. I'm going to take a very quick, deep dip into the proposals and the presentation. Slide 4, NT projects growth of 1.9% in 2025. Now, currently it stands at 0.6, and projection is we are going to grow to 1.9% over the next year. Now, I don't see anything in this proposed budget that's going to be the vehicle to triple the economic growth. On slide 5, domestic risks to the economy, there are 7 bullet points. The 5 last bullet points cannot be indicated as risks. They are not risks. What is a major risk is this proposed budget that does not lead to economic growth and creation of jobs. In its current form, this proposed budget is domestic risk to the future economic outlook. Also on slide number 6, government's medium-term economic strategy is anchored by 4 priorities. But the low GDP growth indicates that past attempts failed in this regard. How does this budget differ from previous budgets in achieving these priorities? We don't see it in this proposed budget. If we look at slide number 10, why is government increasing taxes? And what I've heard so far is we are going to increase tax in the hope to tax ourselves into prosperity and into economic growth, instead of a carving knife into expenses. You cannot tax yourself into prosperity. On slide 12, why the increase in the VAT rate? Once again, this slide compares apples to oranges. We cannot compare with countries with GDP rates and economic growth much higher than ourselves to justify increase in VAT. Very interesting. I think we should all take note, Honourable Minister, you included. Why the increase in VAT rate on slide 13? Listen to this. South Africa has a higher share of personal income tax as a percent of GDP and a high top tax rate, both of which are much higher than other developing economies. Now ask yourself again, Honourable Minister, why are we bleeding professionals? There's your answer. Once again, increasing taxes is not the way to go to create jobs. But on a more positive note, slide 16, further addition to spending is the passenger rail agency, and especially investment in signalling. Now that, Honourable Minister, is an example of economic activity that's being created by investment in infrastructure. Remember, Honourable Minister, if you move people, you move money. Then lastly, Honourable Minister, this is not a budget that ensures growth and job creation. And alternatives to raising VAT and tax should be investigated. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Ryder.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Greetings to the Minister and the entire team, Deputy Minister. I'm mindful of time, so I've got only one question, but I do need to tee it up slightly. So Treasury's own data and projections confirm that there's a diminishing return for the VAT increases. So as VAT goes up, spending power is reduced and therefore the collection of VAT. So this was the experience with the last VAT increase in 2018 when projections were not met. Now, increasing VAT in an environment where there's an already existing cost of living crisis means that consumers are forced to buy less. It's even less after bracket creep is starting to happen because of the lack of change in those brackets. So the additional spending on SARS as an alternative is absolutely welcomed, even if it is hot mark school fees. But I think that the perception of conflict between SARS and the Minister is something of a media manufactured situation as well. But SARS's collections, as they improve, surely this will be able to at least remove the need for the second 0.5% increase and make the temporary increase, make the first 0.5% a temporary measure at worst. So, Minister, can you confirm that as the spending review cuts government?
Honorable Madlopa, kindly close your mic. I'm going to request RTC to help us mute the mics of those that are on the virtual platform.
Thank you, Chair. So, Minister, can you confirm that as the spending review reduces government's needs, that we will not simply find other ways to spend taxpayers' money, but rather ensure that if this increase actually ever gets approved, that it's a temporary measure and it actually gets reversed ultimately? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ryder. Honorable Kwakwa, you may come in.
Thank you very much, Chairperson. Minister, you disclosed information which was very important while delivering your budget speech, that you're a Kaizer Chiefs supporter, and so am I, by the way. But immediately, because I looked at the budget and discovered that we don't have money, I assumed that maybe we started supporting Kaizer Chiefs during the time there was a player called Jacob Chiseve Asnamali. That's what we're trying to tell us, that Asnamali. The Minister, there are certain points I want to highlight. The first thing that came to my mind when I had, let me rather put it differently and say, firstly, you table a plan and you say this is the plan that is going to ignite growth, achieve the targets that you've set for yourselves as Treasury, right? So if that growth is achieved, therefore I'm sure you have at the back of your mind some kind of performance objectives that you want to achieve. Growth and revenue collection, one, right? And then you say we have a revenue shortfall this year, which is quite understandable. And because of that, you have to do tax increases. Right? You are trying to plug a revenue shortfall. But with this plan that you have confidence in, you also project for a VAT increase next year. Is that a vote of no confidence in the plan, given the fact that you've also allocated more resources to SARS to collect more revenue, right? That's the intention of that plan, right? To say next year the situation is going to be different. These are the interventions that we put in place. I can't reconcile the two. But in your presentation, DG, you also said yourself now this morning, no, we're not. The reason why there's a slight difference in the figures, one of the slides, you say is because next year you're not going to, there will be no bracket creep because you have a more positive outlook, isn't it? You're saying next year, no, we probably have to adjust the tax tables for inflation. That's why you are likely to actually get less tax from personal income tax. But the same logic does not apply when you're talking about VAT. I can't reconcile the two arguments. They are contradictory in my view, and they need to be addressed. The other aspect here has to do with the colleagues are correct in saying, whether academically or otherwise, but the comparison when it comes to VAT, it's important for practical purposes, but it's not a neat comparison when you're looking at countries. I mean, we already as a country have to endure the ignominy of being called or labeled as one of the most unequal societies in the world. So you can tell us what they are doing in other jurisdictions, but from a socioeconomic point of view, the context is completely different. Unless we are going to raise a slightly different argument, which will persuade us to look at it differently, but it's not a neat comparison, practical and important as it is. I also, from a policy point of view, Minister, there's an issue I couldn't quite follow. I thought if you've put the interventions in place and you say, as a temporary measure, say increase VAT, hypothetically speaking, then for next year, you'd give us forward guidance, which is an important tool, to say, in the event these fail, we might have to, right? Instead of actually saying definitively, this is what we're going to do. It's like the same way you conduct monetary policy. You make interventions now, but you predict and project for the future and say, other things being constant, this is the direction we're going to take. However, if they don't work this way, this is the route we might have to take. Right, this is the point. The other one was, right before COVID, we made a proposal as a party for the development firstly and the adoption of fiscal rules. Given that the debt to GDP ratio and other numerical targets seems to be a problem in terms of us being able to be disciplined enough, that discussion could not have actually obtained properly during COVID. Perhaps that discussion needs to start now to say, what kind of numerical targets do we want to put, especially on these, the fiscal numerical targets, your debt to GDP ratio, the expenditure, for an example, of the country versus the amount of tax we collect versus the GDP ratio, and all these things and other numerical targets. Perhaps it's important for us to start having that discussion. When it comes to the corporate income tax rate, You've used bracket creep now, meaning in essence you've increased personal income tax. But there's never a discussion, even if you don't increase the corporate income tax rate, in line with the arguments you've made. But I don't hear a discussion that talks about how are we going to be strict when it comes to the tax avoidance schemes that the corporate sector and the private sector is able to engage in, which then reduces the effective corporate income tax rate to about 19%, according to a study which was done by an American, a couple of years ago. So look at these things and say, corporate income tax rate is at 27%. You are not able to increase it for the reasons you've cited, sure. But what are we going to do to try and minimize tax avoidance, which then reduces the tax liability of the many in the corporate sector? The other important issue here has to do with, there is we have now these documents, there's another one which was not delivered, and then amendments were made to it. But page 47 of the one that we had in February speaks about the multiplier effect by when you invest money in the construction sector, you'll recall. And I see that it talks about, for example, if you spend 1 million rands in construction, you're likely to create five jobs, something like that. And the multiplier effect is less for other sectors. And if you're looking at the infrastructure-led growth strategies premised on this issue of building infrastructure, but I'm not getting a sense of how this infrastructure-led growth is going to translate into how many jobs, and whether the sectors or the sectors in government on which we've premised the growth strategy are going to give us the desired outcome in light of the challenges that they face, including the SOEs, which continue to be a drain on the fiscus, including the fact that most of the municipalities are dysfunctional and so on. It could be a contributing factor to you missing the growth targets that you're talking about. Because it's almost like now when we plan as if the institutions which are going to roll out the plan have a certain level of, an above average level of expertise, when most of them are falling apart.
Kindly work towards concluding.
It your process. I thought I was still in my introduction. But
It's so unfortunate.
But let me conclude by saying, Minister, it is quite right in saying, unless we address these underlying issues that have to do, I wanted to make a point. I was trying to lead my point to the municipalities. We are talking about an important issue, which we discussed it a long time ago, the funding formula for municipalities. But without additional revenue, it's going to be a case of robbing Peter to pay Paul, right? Because then we'll be shifting resources from one arm of government to another. It needs to be planned properly because it is not going to serve its purpose. It's just going to be an intention of robbing Peter to pay Paul. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Honorable Kwakwa. Any take from Mpumalanga's Portfolio Committee Chairperson? Okay, Gauteng.
Thank you very much, Chair. My name is Andy Somasai, the Chairperson of the Finance Portfolio Committee in Gauteng. I want to draw the attention of the Minister on slide 16. That speaks about the COVID-19 social relief distress grant. Just to piggyback on that, as the Gauteng legislature, we are inundated with civil society requesting the GPG to action on a epidemic preparedness budget item. So I just want to find out, are there any plans on dedicating a budget item on the epidemic preparedness? The reason they are saying that, and we also think that it's important to look at, is that we have lots of floods that we have been facing, and also they also lead to outbreaks. So we also don't want, the government to be caught napping like we did with the COVID-19. So if there is an appetite, we want to find out, will there be an appetite to put in such a budget item line? Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Majola.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Madam Chair, arising from the Minister's preamble, he said we might take a different route, but we are heading to a same destination. Quoting from that preamble, which was meant to set a tone for this meeting, we all know the destination. The difference is the routes. Some routes are shorter than others. Well, the route that the minister is taking, it's a short route. Engineering speaking, it's called a short circuiting. You leave all steps for connections. You just from the battery and straight to the globe. I'm saying that, Madam Chair, because why increasing VAT? That's the minister's short circuit route. I want to check from the minister whether, in terms of the alternate route, did he considered, other than shifting the blame of not collecting enough to the poor people, did the minister consider to cut from the executive, the size of the executive, maybe to the maximum of 20, and remove all the deputy ministers? Did he consider that route? Did the minister consider to apply intensive measures in terms of curbing corruption, wasteful expenditure, one which has been highlighted here, the first version of this draft budget, how much we wasted there, and others? Did the ministers, in terms of the alternate route, considered to look at the corruption and the wasteful expenditures? The other alternative route, did the minister, well, when you look at the legislations that regulate us when we're doing the budget, it always warns us to say we must be realistic when we do this. Increasing VAT, imposing a VAT increase to the poor people, did the minister consider to implement a wealth tax for those who can afford to pay, and there are no economic consequences out of doing that? The last alternative route, it has been mentioned by a number of speakers. Honorable Minister, there is about 800 billion which has not been collected by SARS. We lost about 8 million through the tax evasions, the ones who avoid tax. Did the minister, instead of considering a 0.5 VAT increase, putting more resources, putting more effort in terms of giving SARS energy to make it sure that we collect this 800 billion? Those are the other alternative routes. My last question, Madam Chair, it's around the plan. Without a plan, we won't even see if we are taking a wrong direction. Madam Chair, we were warned when we were doing the mid-year budget review that without a plan that we will refer to it when we're doing the budget, we will be sound like we're sucking on what we're doing. I want to check, Madam Chair, the status of the 2024 to 2029 medium-term development plan. What is its status? Because I believe that was one of the instruments that was going to assist us to prioritize according to this plan. Where is it now? Has it been approved? Was its content given a consideration when we're doing this budget? Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Machola. Honorable Van Rooyen.
Thank you, Chairperson. The Minister and your team, I must indicate that it is our understanding as MK Party that budget is more than just a financial document. To us, budget is a strategic tool for achieving societal goals and building a better future for any nation. So as a country, South Africa is not an exception. What has been reconfirmed by your proposed budget, Minister, is that our call as MK Party for a more expansionary fiscal stance has fallen on deaf ears. It's our take that the proposed budget failed to address the wealth inequality problem bedeviling our country. Is confirming that the richer will be getting richer and the poor will be getting poor. The recent studies have indicated that in the past financial year only, wealthy people, the few wealthy people, managed to triple their rate of wealth as compared to the inflation rate. The proposed budget, Minister, put more emphasis on de-risking, as earlier indicated by Honorable Member from the EFF. It puts more emphasis on de-risking private sector investment. Chairperson's overdependence on private sector funding is not ideal and can lead to higher tariffs for public services and goods. South Africans, more than any other thing, are calling for a government that takes full responsibility for provision of public services. Let me give you, Minister, as you walk out, a friendly warning. Private sector is more concerned of profits. You should be concerned of the masses of our people. Your proximity to the markets and few wealthy people will cost you dearly. It is our assertion as MK Party that South Africa fiscal policy discussions tend to focus heavily on taxing and borrowing, overlooking some obvious alternatives that we think should be considered. There are many ways to generate funds for economic development. Hence, the government will continue to plead poverty while running one of the richest countries in the world, because we are overlooking these options. And as my engineer friend stated, we are short-circuiting. We are advocating as MK Party as an alternative, because I think the time has come that we should put our solutions as people who are on the touchline of playing in this soccer field, ready to take over. We are advocating for the leveraging of the entire public sector balance sheet, mobilize capital without relying on regressive tax increases like VAT. State control funds like the Unemployment Insurance Fund and the Government Employees Pension Fund, hold substantial assets, Deputy Minister, that can be strategically invested for productive purpose. Just recently, we have seen what China and Singapore, these are two leading or booming economies. What made them successful? Among other things, is the usage of their central bank reserves to fund domestic investment, definitely reducing reliance on external borrowing, as earlier indicated by one honorable member. Now, here at home, we have our reserves. While we name them the gold and foreign exchange contingency reserve account, with approximately 300 billion. That is an underutilized resource in our submission SMK party. While its traditional role was confirmed in our last engagement with yourselves, is to cushion against external shocks, we are arguing that a portion could be strategically allocated to high-impact sectors like manufacturing, renewable energy, and digital infrastructure. I know some people are arguing, I don't know what informed their approach to issues of financial allocations, that some of these amounts are too small for us to be debating about them. But in financial terms, each and every cent counts, each and every cent matters. So what we can use from these reserve bank reserves can go a long way to address our problems. We need to look at introducing policy changes, chairpersons, that will manage and control the outflow of domestic pension funds to offshore markets. Because this exit of our investment to offshore market limit local capital. And I must indicate to yourselves that various research engines established that policy changes that encourages pension funds to invest more domestically could unlock substantial funding for infrastructure and other related industrial initiatives. We fully agree that we must be redirecting even small portion of the 2.3 trillion in pension assets towards domestic projects. That could definitely go a long way to stimulate economic growth. Let's reduce reliance on foreign debt and the long-term employment prospects. Let's reduce reliance on foreign debt because we are indebting future generation. Now, Chairperson, on tax-related issues, you know, I think you will have to expand further, DG, on this personal income tax issue, because in many ways, to me, you are saying there is tax here. If you introduce a provision on this tax regime that is not going to tamper with inflation, then it tells you that there is still tax here. Because the real truth of the matter is that if your personal income tax doesn't talk to inflation, then it means you are reducing the purchasing power of that personal income. So definitely you should be explaining more, because I heard you saying something about it's assumed that in the next financial year it will adjust for inflation. I don't know why you are not citing it on your documents. And the other issue that I think we should look at, SMK party, is on the issue of tax incentives. You know, we introduced, I think it was in 2012, Minister, there was that employment incentive for employment of young people. And I think in the last NATLEC discussion on this matter, it was confirmed that this thing is not helping us. And when you look at the credits and the rebates here, I think we are standing at between 6 and 7 billion that we are paying back to these employers. So could you please confirm, to South Africans that this is a working intervention? If it's not a working intervention, that 6 to 7 billion can be used to generate jobs somewhere, to create jobs somewhere, to industrialize somewhere. It can be used, can be put to better use than what is currently being benefited by these companies. But also, what I didn't see in this, and I will want you to confirm this, Minister, and your team. There was a call from National Treasury that 1.2 billion must be released by National Lottery. Well, it shocked me personally because National Lottery is not funded by government. It's funded by the people, for the people, by the way. That's why it was conceptualized. The money that is generated from lottery tickets is meant to be replowed back in the development of the underserved and the less privileged people of our society. Now, I'm told that you demanded 1.2 billion from National Treasury by the media. I mean, from the lottery. What I want to confirm, because ultimately you only receive 300 million. I was trying to read through your thick books to check where is this allocation. I couldn't find it. Where can I allocate this money? And what was this 300 million used for? And what empowered National Treasury to tap into this? Because I don't remember us discussing as the legislative sector such a provision. Which legislative provision empowered you as National Treasury, to tap into this national resource? Minister, my disappointment on your leadership, the Itala matter. Well, this is not my only disappointment because I know this is the same feeling that is shared by my party. We are seriously questioning your political will to save Itala. Itala, Minister, and you know it very well as a former leader of the labor movement, is the last hope for our underserviced masses in rural areas who can't access the services of the few banks that are monopolizing the banking sector in South Africa. And you are empowered by the Act, Minister. The Banking Act is very clear. Section 1 and 2 of the Act gives you powers to intervene accordingly and save Itala and make it a successful financial institution. But as to why you are not doing that, in fact, we see the Prudential Authority very expeditious in terms of liquidating Itala, even ignoring or snapping the recommendation of this House. So, SMK Party, we are questioning your will, your political will, Minister, to save Itala. And I think, Chairperson, it will be important that, because SMK Party, we are more than ready to introduce amendments to this proposed budget. It will be important as we conclude this meeting, the process of doing that or giving effect to the money bills is clearly outlined to all members of Parliament, so as you are able to take full advantage of the provisions of the Money Bills Amendment Act. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Honorable Van Rooyen, Honorable Makubela. Honorable Minister, can we allow other members to make their inputs?
Thank you so much, Chairperson, and to all the chairpersons, Minister, and your team. Let me start by saying that we appreciate the efforts that have been made in the budget tabling. It's obvious that from what we have received, the state has, over the past few years, failed to manage our public funds. We see it with the level of the high debt ratio. We see it with the slow growth. We see it with the inability to manage the local municipalities, the leakages of corruption and wastage that is happening in the state-owned entities, which is very concerning. And even with the ambitious GDP growth of 1.8% over the next 3 years, as MK Party, we believe that it's not sufficient to address all the inequalities, the living standards of our people, and to reduce unemployment. So I will start with some of my questions to the Minister and the team. We've noted that you have proposed to expand the zero-rated basket to cushion the blow of the VAT increase on the poor and the vulnerable. but you did not provide any immediate relief for struggling households. People already cannot afford the high cost living. What tax relief measures can be put in place to assist the already low income households that are struggling? Because they will be affected by this VAT. My colleague has already spoken about the progressive taxation measures that we believe you could consider, some of those being higher tax on luxury goods and wealth tax and also on the capital goods. And we believe if we focus more on increasing VAT on the luxury goods, we could actually provide relief for the poor. Minister, the AG report tells us that an average of about 20 billion rand has been wasted in Gauteng alone with the Gauteng metros. Half of Tshwane's budget, 15 billion, is missing, unaccounted for, fruitless and wasteful expenditure. We've got a city manager there appointed by the DA, which earns about 5 million rand per annum. We have not seen any consequence management. We have not seen any measures to recover that money and anyone being brought to book to account. City of Joburg, the same, almost 3 billion rand, and Ekurhuleni and many other municipalities in Gauteng. If you total that 20 billion versus what you want to raise in tax, which is 28 billion, we believe that indeed you are being unfair to the general public. We are paying for the sins of the public officials. Something needs to be done, and we need to understand what are you going to do about that. ESCOM, there have been previous measures that have been put to bring ESCOM to a point where it's sustainable and reduces debts. Have those been successful? If no, can you indicate where the failures are, and with these measures that you are putting now in place, how are you going to address it? Including PRASA, how are you going to strengthen the procurement processes? Because the amount of investment that is going to go into PRASA, we are concerned that their procurement system is still very weak and is still providing a lot of room for corruption and leakages. Ghost workers have not been addressed. We are still experiencing a lot of money that goes missing with ghost workers. What has National Treasury done to address that? You talk about the 1.7 billion disaster response. Are we doing anything in terms of being preventative to mitigate these disasters, or are they only skewed to rehabilitation, as is the case now? We know without a shadow of doubt, there will be floods at certain seasons, and there have been over the years. Fires come and go. But what kind of mitigation and readiness measures are we putting in place so that this 1.7 billion can be used effectively to prevent and we save lives instead of having to go after and clean up disaster when people have lost so much and being displaced? Minister, since 2013, 240 spending reviews have been conducted in your department. Can you really provide us with some specific recommendations that you implemented? What were the results? Those that have not been implemented, what are the consequences that you have then instituted to whoever did not implement these recommendations? Because these are important to ensure that we manage the public purse. The budget process is being reassessed to improve the spending. Can you tell us the key areas where the department in the past has failed to effectively fund, and how have you improved that out of this review of your budgeting process? Where are the weaknesses that your department is looking to improve? We want to also understand the anti-corruption measures given the infrastructure investment that is going to be put in place. Clearly, the State Capture Commission process yields no fruit. It has become in itself the biggest scandal with billions paid to that State Capture Commission, yet no results. What practical anti-corruption measures are you going to put in place to ensure that this infrastructure investment actually achieves what it needs to do to improve the public infrastructure, to provide services to the poor and the vulnerable, and also to create jobs? Minister, the biggest risk that we see in this budget is the political risk. The lack of consensus politically on this budget, it concerns us as MK. We want this budget to be approved like yesterday because we know that without a budget, we cannot pay the social grants. We are putting the most vulnerable at risk. Other sectors of our community can afford perhaps to be without this budget. And this is because of the GNU that cannot agree on key things that are very important to your budget. And we agree with you on the pro-poor measures that you have put in this budget. The social grant increases, the expansion of the VAT zero-rated food. We agree with the infrastructure investment aimed at improving public services and also creating jobs, the early childhood development, the investment in health and education, especially for our poor and rural communities, the social relief grant expansions. These are very good measures. We agree with the expropriations and the Bella bill. We may feel that you need to really expropriate the land without compensation. Are you considering other parties, progressive parties, that will support you so that you are able to perform your job without a gun on your head to change your policy stance? We do not need to be doing policy trade-offs that are affecting the poor and delaying the implementation of this budget. And lastly, Minister, other colleagues have covered the VAT issue and how you're going to keep increasing the VAT because you are about to trigger a VAT revolt. We know that you ran away from tax because you know there's a tax revolt already. You're about to trigger a VAT revolt, and people are looking for alternative ways to get the services that they need, especially the rich. How are you going to counter that when they start to avoid the VAT with clever ways and as they do the tax currently, especially the big corporates? Thank you so much.
Thank you, Honorable Makubela. Honorable Squati.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to the presentation that has been made by the Minister, Deputy Minister, and the team. And I think we should, Chairperson, agree and accept that the budget as tabled has created some advances in terms of the country, but also, whether we like it or not, there are some protection measures that the budget has created, particularly that relates to the poor. And I agree with the issues that my fellow colleagues are raising in terms of VAT. And I think there's a need for us to continue to look at other measures in terms of making sure that we can bring in more revenue and avoid burdening the poor. As much as we are protecting the poor, but we also need to make sure that we do not burden the poor. We should welcome the efforts that have been made in terms of supporting SARS to look for other measures, especially in terms of areas that SARS has already identified where we can actually find more or be able to create more revenue, particularly in terms of those that are not already paying by now or are actually complying in terms of tax, which I think would go further in terms of assisting us in making sure that at least we are able to generate more revenue. I think we must also welcome the fact that we are seeing more increase in terms of infrastructure spending. in recent years, we haven't seen such an advance in terms of infrastructure spending, which is one of the areas that we believe that will contribute towards economic growth, but also in terms of some of the actions that are actually taken, particularly that relates to Vulindlela, which we are hoping that it will ultimately be able to assist in terms of that infrastructure fund that we are putting forward. Because with infrastructure, we believe that it will be able to unlock a number of areas in terms of economic growth. I mean, it would be a shame for us to not to acknowledge that the spending in infrastructure will contribute towards that. However, Minister, what is important is the fact that we need to see efficiency in terms of expenditure and make sure that we avoid wasteful expenditure. But it does not help us as much as we can generate revenue, as much as we can have enough allocations. But as long as there is no accountability in terms of the allocations, as long as we are not able to get any meaningful progress out of the allocations that are being made, we are not doing anything. So I'm just saying we are seeing that, yes, in terms of Transnet, there is going to be some movement. But with PRASA, I think we also need to make sure that the allocations that we are making are actually going to go where they're supposed to be going and are actually going to bring the outcomes that are intended. Because as long as they are saying that they still have got challenges, we must make sure that those challenges are actually dealt with. I mean, I was looking at the budget speech. I'm not sure whether it's already instituted or there is an intention to institute some measures in terms of strengthening the procurement systems. So I think it's one of the things, because we know where we are coming from with the PRASA. We know what it is capable of. And we need to make sure, but also we also need to consider the progress that has been made so far. But we should not go there blindfolded because of the progress that we have made, because of the resources that we are going to allocate. I think the issue of the PSP needs to be really supported. It's one of the things that we have been saying, that let us look at the logistics, because logistics, we are actually as a country losing that competitiveness. The East Africa is looking at their own, and sooner or later, if we do not change, it would mean that including SADC countries, they would be going towards East Africa for logistics. So the sooner we do that, the better. And it can only be done with private sector. You know, it doesn't matter what we think of private sector, but the reality is, as a country, we are aware that we do not have the necessary fiscals for us to be able to unlock some of the potentials. And with the private sector, we can be able to bring in new money that we do not have, that will take 30, 40 years for us to be able to have. So we need to really consider that, so that we are able to fast track the growth of the economy, but also make sure that we are able to start ensuring that we do not lose our competitive edge in terms of logistics as a country. So we need to really pay attention to those. The last thing that I think we need to look at, we're talking about the challenges of departments, or whether it's provinces or national departments, that are actually spending without the necessary allocations. And I think it's a danger that we really need to deal with. Because if Treasury is going to allow provinces or departments to spend money that they don't have, Because what happens here, Minister, is that it's easy for us to actually take the allocated resources and available resources, spend it on pet projects, and take what we believe that it's a necessity for us to be able to undertake within a particular department, and say that this will make it a pressure so that we create accruals. And those accruals will then be focused on what is necessary and what is meaningful within that particular department. Whereas the available resources are actually spent on pet projects. So I don't think we should burden the national fiscus on, I'm concluding, Chair. The national fiscus on the basis of us sympathizing with those that are creating the accruals. Unless we are able to say ourselves that we have satisfied ourselves and those accruals were actually necessary, and the priorities within those departments or provinces have actually been looked at, and they've actually taken the necessary steps to make sure that the decisions that are being taken are actually quality decisions. Because we are going to go into a dark dungeon where we'll never be able to come out of. Because every province will create accruals. If this province one can create accruals and national department is able to take responsibility, all of us can as well go. So I think we really need to make sure that we avoid that. There are cautions that have been made with health and education, and therefore people should be able, or departments and provinces should be able to learn to spend within their means. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Kadebe. You may come in. Members, let me just caution you, we are 25 minutes to 1 o'clock. So it means we might go beyond 1 o'clock, looking at how the deliberations are going. So just bear with me on the time. It is because of your robust engagement. Honorable Kadebe.
Thank you, Honorable Co-Chairpersons. Good afternoon, everyone in the meeting here. My point of departure will be to appreciate the Ministry and the Treasury Department for trying very hard to steer the finances of the country in the right direction. And then we've got a proof that that steering is going the right direction, because even if the biggest economy tried to attack South Africa is still intact. It shows that we have policy independence. And that policy independence can only come through shrewd management of the financial resources of the country. That's why the department must be appreciated for that. But what also is very important, I heard one of my colleagues saying that he likes SARS. He's a fanatical supporter of SARS, which is good because SARS is the goose that lays the golden eggs. But on my side where I'm seated, I'm a fanatical supporter of Parliament. Because without Parliament, everything will collapse. What I would have liked to see is that the allocation to Parliament must really increase, so that it is able to attend the issues it's supposed to attend. I'll make an example. One of my colleagues spoke about the issue of the State Capture Commission. The State Capture Commission was very clear that it referred a lot of issues to Parliament. So if Parliament will not have requisite resources to ensure that its portfolio committees and select committees are doing the right job in overseeing the departments, and then we'll always have these leakages which we are having in the various departments, because if the portfolio committees cannot be able to oversee the departments in real time, and then it will only come after the Auditor General's report, then the country is going to be in trouble. So I'll really appeal that when coming to this new budget cycle we're going to have, the Parliament must be engaged early so that it can get the requisite resources so that it can do its job, what's supposed to do. But what is also critical here, with this budget, I liked the issue of defending the frontline services. If we are going to deal with health, if we are going to deal with health and the police service, if we are going to deal with education, it means that we are investing in the future of the country. I think that this budget, with 61% of it going to that in that direction, I think that it must be supported for that. But in order to continue supporting it, it is the issue that we have to have a strong and robust economic growth. In order to have a strong and robust economic growth, it means that the SOEs must be able to do their job. You can go anywhere in the world. You will see that there's no country which thrived without a proper functioning SOEs. Even here in the past, when we spoke about railways, we spoke about the airways, those were the entities which were able to provide experiential training for our children. Because when we are going to continue to have this high rate of unemployment, it means that this future is doomed. Because when you look even at this current budget as it is, the personal income tax is the one which is the largest chunk of the budget. But if we have so many people who are unemployed, it means that moving forward, it will continuously shrink. So it is our responsibility as Parliament and these committees which are here and the parties which are here to ensure that we stimulate economic growth so that the employment can be stimulated. But as far as the South African National Defence Force, I think it was overdue, that it must be recapitalized. And then also what is very important is that the new acts which have been signed, Expropriation Act, is a necessary intervention in the economy so that it can be able to, because without the property, how are the new emerging businesses going to advance? So the state must be given the capacity to do that. Also the issue of the NHI, we cannot afford to shy away from it. I think that this budget is trying to deal with that and prepare the NHI, the implementation of NHI. So I think that's where we have to emphasize this thing so that we are able at the end of the day to stand proud as South Africans that we are going to make South Africa to work. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Honorable Kadebe. Honorable Oliphant from Northwest.
No, thank you very much, Chairperson and your co-chairpersons, Minister, Deputy Minister, DG Commissioner, your team, good morning. Chairperson, I just want to deal with just a few issues in terms of the Northwest in particular. Firstly is to welcome the simplification of the triple Ps in respect of the new regulations that have been issued, but also then to just ask for clarity in terms of the threshold of 2 billion rand. I raise that particularly in respect of infrastructure in municipalities. I'll use one example, Chairperson, in the Northwest in particular, the city of Matlosana, where you have about 60% losses on water infrastructure and about 54% losses, technical, non-technical losses on electricity. That gives you a clear picture that the municipality is never going to be able to service its bulk debt. But also that if one goes a bit further and you look at the tariff structure, it also creates another problem. The 2 billion threshold in terms of possible investments in infrastructure from a triple P perspective is not necessarily going to cater holistically. If you can plug, perhaps the Treasury can indicate if there would be provision for anything above the 2 billion rand that would assist in terms of public sector infrastructure, if that clarity can be provided, so that you assist municipalities to close the gap on infrastructure investment that will ultimately assist them in terms of revenue generation and later on revenue collection issues. I thought I must just make that one point because in particular our municipalities are struggling with issues relating to bulk service infrastructure. The other issue I wanted to speak to, Chairperson, is the issue. We know that mining contributes significantly to the economy of our country, but at the same time, it's the mining activities which impact our road infrastructure negatively in the Northwest. Perhaps that when the Minister looks at the conditional grants, that the Northwest be considered progressively or positively in terms of its road infrastructure, particularly because we have already set a precedent. If you look at, I think it's the coal haulage infrastructure, coal haulage grant that assists the Mpumalanga province quite significantly. I think the Northwest should be able to benefit in the same way because the road infrastructure is worn out, and that's caused primarily by mining activities. Chair, just in closing, to then say that there is a need for us to look at the inefficiencies in government, both provincial and local government. We need to be a bit more aggressive in terms of that. We can't allow for continued wastage and seepage. And also to say to the Minister that I think we note the difficult terrain within which you had to put this budget together, the fancy footwork you had to put into place, and I think that is really welcome. I think we also need to say that we are confident in terms of the capacity that is created, the investment, further investment, budget investment in SARS. We are confident that you'll be able to pull it off and put us on a better footing. Thank you very much, Chairperson.
Thank you, Honorable Oliphant. Honorable Mazibuko.
Thank you very much, Chair, and greetings.
Before you come in, Honorable Mazibuko, I'm going to request those that are on the virtual platform to raise their hands for noting so that immediately after Honorable Mazibuko, we can take their hands to allow the Minister to respond to all the questions that have been raised without going back to the virtual platform. Thank you, Honorable Mazibuko, and I'm sorry for that.
Thank you very much, Chair, and greetings to all of you, Chair, and greetings to the members present in the House, especially the member from my province, from Gauteng. Chair, the President in his SONA set an outlook target of 3% economic growth, which I think it is key to address the current challenges we have of unemployment, the huge gap that keeps on extending of inequality, poverty, as well as revenue shortfalls. So my question to Treasury would be, or I would request Treasury to unpack the fiscal policy measures which will enhance a rapid economic growth trajectory in the short and medium term as projected. Secondly, Honorable Minister, your budget speech lays out a bold yet pragmatic roadmap for addressing South Africa's long-standing economic stagnation. So, how will the fiscal framework you have presented support the transformation fund target of the 100%, of 100 billion over 5 years? And what measures are required to enhance financial sector asset allocation to support value addition and industrial growth that we all seek? On the SDG grant, Chair, in light of the North Gauteng High Court judgment, where National Treasury is criticized for imposing unlawful and unconstitutional requirements on SRD grant applicants in an attempt to curtail public expenditure, how is the tabled budget structured in a manner that directly benefits all eligible beneficiaries, including those being unfairly excluded, to identify as well those who have fraudulently benefited, because we know, or it is said that there are beneficiaries that are benefiting from this SRD grant, but they do not qualify. They entered the system through fraudulent activities. So how then is this budget structured to identify all those people and make sure that the correct beneficiaries do benefit? On revenue, Chair, we know that if we do not collect enough revenue, all these interventions the minister has spoken about, you know, the payment of no-fee schools, because we know that there's no free education. It is free education to our citizens, but somebody is paying, which is government, for this, as well as the free health care. Government is paying for the grants. Government is paying the SDG grant that has been implemented with no budget. Government has to pay. And revenue collection, for me, is key in this. Otherwise, all these interventions will remain a dream. Therefore, Treasury, to what extent can strengthening revenue collection capacity of local and provincial governments contribute in enhancing the overall financial demands of the state? And what other wealth tax-related measures, Minister, can be considered to increase our revenue base as a redistributive measure to fund key growth economic sectors with high multiplier effects? And how is SARS dealing with the proliferation of business? Because we see the proliferation of business that are cash-based to evade tax and to enable illicit flows, which is a problem to our country. So on local government, Chair, which I think is my last point, in addition to Honorable Tambo's point, what are the considered options in the review of the white paper of local government, particularly in relation to the equitable share, which we have been speaking about many times in our committee, as well as revenue generation capacity? So I think that is all that I wanted to give input to, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Honorable Khadebe, seated there.
Thank you so much, Honorable Co-Chairpersons. Mine is very short in that I want to congratulate the ministry, the minister, the deputy ministers, and the team. As the IFP, we acknowledged that this was not an easy task. The path towards finalizing the budget was not easy. We acknowledge that, and we are optimistic that there should be some elements of positivity in the budget, more especially on the issues that some of my colleagues have alluded to, like the accommodating the infrastructure investment in municipal entities responsible for water and sanitation, electricity, energy, and solid waste management services. We applaud that. In essence, we hope that there are going to be stricter efforts to deal with issues of wasteful expenditure, unauthorized expenditure in some of the areas where we have seen that happening. But all in all, we appreciate the effort from the ministry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm not seeing any hands on the virtual platform. This is an indication that all hands that needed to be noted were exhausted, but earlier I saw a hand of Warren Povey, Breadline Africa. I don't know if he's one of the members, but if it's a stakeholder, I'm going to request that we suppress you in this meeting because public participation is still coming and we'll expect you to really participate at that platform. I am sorry for suppressing you. I'm going to hand over to the minister and the team to respond to the questions that have been asked by members.
Thank you, DG.
I am so sorry. I also did not give a chance to the honorable chairperson sitting in front, but them, I'm going to give them 3 minutes each. And then, Honorable Mauto, is there something that you would want to raise?
Yeah, no, thank you, Chair. I know that in the interest of time, we did not deal with the agenda item. We skipped apologies. We don't see the Deputy Minister Sarupen here in the meeting. And it's been 2 hours now, we're going for 3 hours. So I thought if you had engagements prior, he would have joined us by now. So there's no indication of him. Can we perhaps get a reason for his absenteeism in this meeting? Because it's a very critical meeting. So we can't have the Deputy Minister just missing in the air. We don't know where he is, whether he has decided to leave the GNU, we don't know.
I think you've made your point, Honorable Mauto. It will be noted, and I should say maybe it's an oversight from me that we did not deal with apologies. The only apologies that we had for members are those that requested to leave early for their flights, but they did promise that immediately when they vacate the area, they will log in virtually for them to listen to the responses. I think the minister, when responding, the team from the National Treasury will indicate the absence of
I think
the Deputy Minister.
I don't know what he's going to say. They are asking him in his capacity as Deputy Minister.
No, let me, in as much as I've given a chance to Honorable Mauto, maybe an honorable member has a point to make.
Thank you, Chair. The Deputy Minister, Asher Sarupen, is looking after his mother today, who is undergoing critical cancer treatment.
We really are with him in these trying times, but this is not how the apologies are forwarded to all our on our committees. I think the Deputy Minister is not for the first time he's absent in meetings, and he has been sending apologies. Let's just wait. Maybe the team from the National Treasury or the Minister will submit his apology. But for now, the apology is not taken as it is not forwarded in a manner in which we expect it to be forwarded to this meeting. Thank you, Honorable Maimane.
Thank you, Chairperson. I'll do my best to be very quick. Minister, I think I can concede the fact that there are a number of key issues, and I want to use the metaphor of a train, because if we don't get this exercise correct, we will have a train wreck. And I think that is the last position we need from a budgeting point of view. Let me speak about the tracks as a start. I think that if I can ask and enjoin Treasury and members of Parliament who are here, we really need to urgently review the white paper on local government. The reality of it is that the 90-10 formulation is no longer working. It's going to create a deficit in terms of what municipalities are able to do in furnishing their debt as it pertains to ESCOM. Secondly, I think that colleagues have spoken extensively about the state of local government and wasteful and fruitless expenditure there. I think we need to think about that 52 billion rands indicated by the Auditor General and being able to appoint administrators there that can help us. Principally, Minister, I think that you would see that SADC have already made a view on the withdrawal of the troops from the DRC. I'm hoping South Africa will join that. That will adjust the defense budget. I go back to my first point, which is to say, one of my perhaps disappointment with the budget, and I think that speaks to all of us, that's why this session can't in and of itself be a portfolio committee. The portfolio committee work has to happen post facto, and what I'm really wanting to ask is that we really need to confront policy choices. And I think Parliament must express itself that, and political parties must be given the right to make the choices they need to make. We can't publicly talk about VAT or SRD. That is a choice. We have to make it. We have to make a choice whether it's going to be personal income tax or wealth tax. That is a choice, and we have to make it. We have to make a decision about whether it's early childhood development or free higher education. That is a choice. But what is the reality is we can't have both, because the assumption that we can have early childhood, free higher education, SRD, a VAT hike, add personal income tax, corporate tax, keep adding all of these baskets, in all harsh reality, it is the surest way for us to create conditions upon which we will have a train smash when it comes to the budget. Now, I think colleagues have raised here a number of assumptions, and I don't need to repeat the points about assumption on growth, assumption on SARS collections and the accuracy and all of that. But Minister, I want to implore you, we must find money for the NPA and the SIU. In truth, both those institutions have raised the fact that they are being underfunded, which means their ability to prosecute for years of mismanagement and money effectively being stolen is significantly undermined. And therefore, in this regard, I do think that there will come a point where we'll need to declare the funding on the Zondo Commission as wasteful and fruitless expenditure. I think on the debt management strategy, I think we need to talk about that, and I would enjoin that when Treasury comes to our committee, we need to speak extensively about how we deal with debt management strategy. To raise it to 76.5 peaking is an assumption. And the previous assumption was 75, we've moved it to 76. And in all fairness, I think IMF projections are 80% of GDP. If we, as per the graph that has been demonstrated here today, want to peak at 76, then I'd like to understand the strategy around that issue more specifically. On the local government issue, I hear colleagues have raised this. I was in Kabeja yesterday. My biggest worry is that we've allocated 89 million rands for the rebuilding of infrastructure lost to disaster management. Just pure incapacity has meant zero of that money has been spent. MIG grants end up getting returned. And I'm unclear that if we don't deal with the capacity at local government, if we take the total expenditure allocation for infrastructure in the next medium term, we will really be throwing it at a local government that is incompetent. And that would genuinely create conditions for wasteful and fruitless expenditure. On the last, Minister, I think my questions are in essence in short. The first is, we've got too many foreign missions, and it is incongruent with the amount of trade, which means we deploy people and we've got embassies, we've got ambassadors, but we are getting limited value for money in the countries we often deploy. And I think that the limiting of the foreign service will have to, and I don't ever want to be one of those who suggests cuts in millions to get billions, but cumulatively, all of these expenses matter. Secondly, along with that, not only are foreign agencies, but issues such as all of these agencies that we seem to have and various departments have. We have done an analysis as to where agencies, MDDA, and there are so many that sit in various portfolios, sport, etc., are accruing agencies where money is being set aside for them, but their value in terms of what they deliver is very limited. And I think I don't need to go into cabinet, etc. So I think what we've got to think about, I am wrapping it up, I apologize, Chairperson. I think then the question becomes, we are going to have to do a lot of work on the expenditure side, but not only looking at where the millions can be saved, but also equally so the billions of an exercise. But I would urge the conversation this Parliament must have is on policy choices and ultimately reviewing policies. Or if we fail to do those exercises, all budgets from henceforth will just be us adjusting for systems that are failing. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Maswanganyi.
Thank you, Chair. Mine will not be questions, it will be comments. Let's welcome the presentation from the Minister, accompanied by the Deputy Minister, SARS Commissioner, DG, and the team. And welcome the investment on infrastructure. We hope that it will yield positive results, more especially creating jobs for young people. One, DG, you have published the draft rates bill, which will effect VAT on the 1st of May. We haven't seen the media statement, and we don't see where you have invited the public for comment. You are going to have a legal challenge if you don't do that. Unless you have done it, we don't see it in the web. But some people called me this morning and said they are worried that National Treasury, we are going to have our own public participation exercise, but National Treasury has not published an invitation for participation by the public. And there are regulations in terms of time frame. So you'll get into trouble. I think, Chair, we need a full session on SOEs. We are in this trouble because of SOEs. We've bailed them a lot. There are many business practitioners, but still there are many problems. So we'll create a space, a day, where we'll discuss SOEs. What has been happening? We'll take that was used to bail them out. What was the business practitioner doing there? And why should they continue to be bailed out moving forward? Because if we incur more debt, we are going to create the problem for the unborn, because this budget is for the living and the unborn. So we should not create a generational problem. So we'll have a day full for SOEs and deal with them seriously so. And they will have to be here themselves, Minister. I think, Chairperson, let's create time and go to SARS offices in Brooklyn. Why I say this, we have been there 2 years back, so that when we discuss the issue of taxes and SARS, we do it in their ICT hub. You will have an appreciation that SARS is no longer the old way of chasing people conventionally. Things have gone cyber digital now. And criminals are also there in the cyberspace. You can't catch them physically and send police. No, they are so sophisticated. So it will be important that we go there, have a full briefing there, have a discussion on SARS, on tax matters. When we were there with the president and the minister, the deputy minister celebrating, I think it was 25 years, we had a full appreciation of what SARS is doing in regard to tax collection and the movement that they've gone through in terms of building the capacity. So seated here in Cape Town, you will have an understanding, but you will not have a full appreciation. So I will suggest that, Alan, we create a one-day trip to SARS and deal with issues of SARS and mobilization of resources and so many other issues. And lastly, the issue raised by Honorable Van Rooyen, Minister, please, you are a member of Parliament and you have been a member of Parliament for many years. If Parliament writes a letter to the Minister should respond. If we say 10 days, the Minister should respond within 10 days. Please respect the separation of powers. The issue of Itala, every day we wake up, is Itala. We have run out of explanations. And the executive, yourself and the executive of KwaZulu-Natal provincial government should assist us to respond to issues of Itala. We had enough issues of VBS. Now it's Itala. So please do that, because otherwise it's like you are just ignoring Parliament, or these are my comrades, I'll respond to them at the right time. But let's respect the doctrine of the separation of powers. Be that as it may, we will have to have more engagements moving forward on critical issues, including the 3% growth that the President has spoken about. We must create space to discuss that in detail, not only within 2 hours. Thanks very much, colleagues and Chairperson.
Honorable
Chair, I just need to step in here because there's aspersions being cast. I've now confirmed with the Finance Committee Secretary that he did receive from Deputy Minister Ashley.
Honourable Member.
No, you're going to have to hear me out on
Honourable
this because
Member.
your house is not in order.
Honourable Member,
You
you are not
received it
a
on your
member
email
of the executive.
and you skipped the apology.
You are not the PA of
Get
the
your house in
Deputy
order
Minister.
before you start casting
The only way
aspersions.
to get my house in order, I think, is to allow you to go out if you are going to interject when other members are speaking. It is not your responsibility to deal with the Deputy Minister's diary. You are a member
It's
of
your
Parliament in
responsibility
this
and
meeting.
you should do it.
I think it's better you leave this meeting if you are going to behave this way. Thank you, Honourable Ndlovu.
Thanks, Honourable Chairperson. You know, it's difficult when we share the mic. I wish I had a mic. Yeah. Honourable Chairperson, I've got several questions, but I'm not going to be long. I don't want to make political speeches. Just go straight to the questions. What is the National Treasury's plan to increase local government's allocation in the long term? Because the current 9% of the national revenue is simply too small, seeing that majority of municipalities are in rural, especially where I come from, Limpopo. What is the long-term revenue generation other than VAT and income tax? The other question, Chair, is how does the government plan to address tax evasion and ensure compliance with the new tax policies? The other one, how will the proposed tax reforms affect low and middle income households? What measures are being taken to manage the national debt, and what is the long-term debt sustainability plan? I think the last one, Chair, is with regard to, I think I was writing here, yes. How will the government plan borrowing needs with the goal of fiscal responsibilities? Thanks.
Thank you. Over to the National Treasury. I'm going to request that you try and sum up.
No,
Some questions need similar responses.
Yeah.
Just sum up all the questions that have been asked by members. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. But let me just deal with one point. You know, Deputy Minister Sarupe, if he was there, if he was here, he would be here as a deputy minister, not a representative of the DA. We would then have been asked by the chair, where is the deputy minister? And it's incumbent upon us to respond, because we know where Deputy Minister Sarupen is. It's not for the DA to come and do that. The next set of issues, I'm going to give the team to respond to some of the questions. We'll take some broad ones. The issue, the EFF was explicit, are these things, 800 doctors, these staff members are talking about in health services, going to be funded now? The answer is, if the budget is passed, the answer is yes. I'm not second guessing Parliament. The answer is yes. The debate about growth is going to be quite important, that, as the chairperson says, we probably need some time to interrogate it. Because if growth is not like an ignition in a car, all of us, the car drives. You put a number of things in place even the private sector, before you could talk about them, they must then have confidence that the policy framework and other things are in place, then they can invest. And once when invest, it takes there's a time lag. But let me say, I'm not going to be in detail, the team is going to deal with the detail. Let me say, the member from the DA says, I acted against the advice of my team. It has never happened. Probably his informer, whoever he is, informed him incorrectly. It's quite important that I must inform this House that I've never done that. This team can attest to that. After coming with the 2%, the team was saying it's a good proposal. However, how confident are you that even the president is not going to change? Because if you change down the line, the amount of work we do in modeling is detailed. We may have to change the date of the budget. That was the argument from the team. And I think the people who told you and you come to the conclusion that I'm a rogue minister, it's wrong to treat, to refer to somebody like that. I think that's wrong. Let's have a respect for each other.
Minister, I'm going to request that you respond through the chairpersons.
So, okay, but you didn't protect the language you used was problematic. So the second member of the DA says, and that must be corrected, we were given sound proposals, I ignored them. As of now, I don't have a proposal from the DA. All I do know is that they've sent a letter to the president, not to me. They've sent a letter to the president, not to me. I've never had those proposals. Indeed, there were other things they raised in cabinet. Those things that were raised in cabinet, such as spending reviews and structural reforms, are incorporated in the speech. But the thing the colleagues need to understand, spending reviews is not something you can. Let me just give you an example. GTEC has done 240 spending reviews. Let me just give you a complicated one. It says on the rental stock, we are paying 45% than the market price. I trust McPherson. But if you had to give McPherson to implement that today, just to unravel one rental, it's going to cut action, so and so. It's going to take time to deal with this spending reviews. It's not going to be a 3-month period. So we urge the comrades, the colleagues to work with us and have an understanding of how government works. So a question from 2 colleagues said, of the 5% from Honorable Godongwana and Ryder, we have said in the speech, the second 5 assume everything remains the same. Any changes in our revenue structure, we may drop that 5 in the next financial year. That's what we've said. It's quite important that that message, again, is corrected. I don't want to delay you. Let me give the team to respond. Insofar as Itala is concerned, I would like to take this thing with Honorable Van Rooyen and any other members as a separate matter for discussion. Since I joined this government, I've tried to work with the colleagues and the government of KZN without success. I can write a story and a book about it. Up to the time when the Prudential Authority finally took this thing. So let's discuss. I'm more than happy to have a discussion on it. We have included the spending reviews precisely because that's a request from the colleagues from the DA. We've included structural reforms and a detailed emphasis on structural reforms in the speech to accommodate what they have been requesting. I've not ignored them. Did you can, oh, the other, even the commissioner is going to take some 2 questions. Did you can take some of the, not every, the highlights, some of the highlights.
Thank you, Minister. With your permission, I'll ask the teams to just very briefly come in on their areas, and then I'm happy to come in at the end and then hand back to you. And if they can try and be as succinct as possible, starting with Oghali.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, honorable members, Minister DG. So on the local government white paper review, just to indicate to members that this review has already started. So DCOC has asked us to provide inputs and also to chair the finance work stream. So we'll be participating in this work stream and will provide progress at a later stage. And just to indicate that on the local government, obviously the equitable share part, that also as National Treasury were reviewing the whole local government fiscal framework, including the revenue powers obviously that are given to the sphere of government to raise revenue. And obviously, as members have already indicated, there are losses that has been reported by AG. And then on the issue of whether the 28.9 billion includes the 800 post-com doctors, yes, they do. And I suppose the question was why were we not able to keep the 9,000, almost 9,000 doctors in the system. And I think this issue has kind of been, in a way, answered in the sense that, as one member indicated about the issue of the accruals in the system, that obviously what department tends to do is to ensure that the money that they have go towards the home bodies, and then there's pressure in other areas. And we do agree with the honorable member that committing, over-committing the departments is irregular in terms of the PFMA. So therefore, we do accept that, but those challenges that are really beyond, as we know that there's been pressures in this department. So I think probably, maybe the last question was the issue of funding to provinces, to say it's really not about the sphere of government, but if government decides that you don't need the sphere of government, clearly those functions must go somewhere because they deliver critical services such as education and health. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairs, honourable members. On a couple of the tax points, there were quite a few concerns about base erosion, profit shifting, and illicit financial flows. We've done a lot of legislative amendments over the last few years to try and curb those measures. We've put in stricter interest limitations. The one big measure we did was a global minimum tax that we included in the budget last year. That is actually still anticipated to raise 8 billion from multinationals in 26-27. It's not in this current budget table because we announced it last year, but that is a large increase that the corporates are expected to pay from the following fiscal year. There were a few questions on the adjustments for the brackets. We recognize the impact on lower income households. As a clarification, the table assumes that there won't be any change for inflation in this coming year. However, for the next 2 years, it will be fully adjusted for inflation. So there will be full inflationary relief to those households in the following 2 years. Well, that's what's assumed. It's not in the budget at the moment, but it's assumed in those numbers. My colleague will get to growth, but the biggest point is if we had to raise revenue, VAT was the best instrument to do so from a growth perspective. It has the lowest impact on jobs, on investment, and ultimately on growth, but Boipuso will do that. The employment tax incentive, that was discussed in NEDLAC in 2019. The proposals from NEDLAC was for it to be extended for 5 years. It went to the Standing Committee on Finance. The Standing Committee on Finance recommended it was extended for 10 years, which is why it's currently to 2029. But we're happy to look at that and reevaluate and see whether that is a potential mechanism. On luxury goods, we do have a luxury goods tax at the moment. It's an ad valorem excise duty, which is 9% extra on top of VAT, on top of everything else on specific luxury goods. It goes all the way up to 30% for luxury vehicles. We raise about 7 billion from that per year. The long-term revenue generation, other than VAT and PIT, in our view, it is growth. Growth will get us higher revenues, and hopefully we won't need to change rates, as well as improving efficiencies at SARS. Chair, on the draft rates bill, we didn't put a media statement out. Earlier today, it was published on the SARS website for comment to be taken. There are Treasury and SARS emails which commentators can make to that. The closing period for comments would be the 31st of March. Thank you, Chair.
Good morning, chairs, honorable members, Minister DG. Thank you very much for the opportunity to respond to the questions. We received quite a few questions on the growth front. I'm Wipuso Modise. I head economic policy at the National Treasury, so those would be in my direction generally. I've tried to group, by way of your guidance, Chair, the general questions we received into 5 broad categories, and I'll address them in turn. I'll start with the more sort of fundamental, sort of broader question around forecast errors and how confident the Treasury is at its ability to produce macroeconomic forecasts. And in brief, our assessment that we do internally, but also research, but also assessments done by other researchers and peers, have found that the National Treasury's projections tend to be generally better than our peers in year and as good as any other forecaster over the medium term, suggesting that we are good at our job in this regard. That said, there is always room for improvement, and we do so by doing the following things. We invest in people, we invest in processes, and we invest in tools. We ensure that our tools are fit for purpose. We ensure that we do so by ensuring that they are aligned to international best practice and calibrate them accordingly. You will know, honorable members, that in 2021, we also published a box with the MTBPS that gave a sense of an update to QMOD, which is our quarterly projections model that we use to run our macroeconomic projections that inform the fiscal framework. Beyond this, we've got a suite of other models that we do off-model work on to help us understand and inform our view on the baseline, which informs the macro fiscal planning process. And as you can imagine, as things and events precipitate and present themselves, we have to do complicated analysis that isn't always necessarily most appropriate for a single source or tool or technique. And as a result, we are having to think about these things across the spectrum of models at our disposal, and then we sort of condense them to help inform our macroeconomic projections. And this approach has served us well in the past and will continue to do so. We also ensure that the people on our team are, one, appropriate for the jobs that they do and are adequately trained. We invest a significant amount of money and time in capacity building to ensure that we produce the right kinds of teams for the work that we need to do. And finally, we make sure that our processes are appropriate for the work that we need to do, not only from a forecasting perspective, but also more broadly from a macro fiscal planning perspective, people, processes, and tools. Beyond this, we also spend a lot of time and resources in collaborating with researchers and through partnerships like our SA Tide program, where we've published more than 200 papers on all kinds of issues, including macro fiscal planning, that inform our view on projections and also help us to think about some of these complicated issues as they present themselves, so we are able to best reflect them in our projections. The second question relates to our growth outlook, and we got quite a few questions regarding this. And in brief, what makes us so confident, or where do we think growth is going to come from the 0.6% actuals that were published at the end of, for the end of last year, by Stats SA slightly earlier this year, and how do those then find expression in our macroeconomic baseline? In brief, first, just to clarify, and the DG mentioned this in the presentation that he did, we were unable to incorporate the fourth quarter GDP print into our current projections owing to timing. We just didn't have enough time to run those projections and still make the print. An important footnote is presented with table 2.2 in chapter 2 that indicates that beyond the GDP print, there are also data series from the quarterly bulletin that weren't released in time for us to incorporate into our baseline. But as you would know, on a quarterly basis, we update our models and our projections to ensure that the macro fiscal planning process is up to date and informed with the best and most up-to-date available information. And that is presented with the table in chapter 2.2 as a footnote. To answer your question, specifically around where we think the drivers of growth are in 2025 and over the medium term, in brief, gross domestic expenditure, which is the combination of consumption and investment. We provide quite a detailed overview of what these key drivers are. I will give a very brief overview in the interest of time, but just to ensure that the honorable members adequately answered. From a consumption perspective, we see lower inflation, lower interest rates, and subsequently a lower cost of borrowing, as well as some upside from two pots, from withdrawals from the two-pot system, providing some impetus to consumption. Over the medium term, stronger consumer sentiment, as well as a slower wage recovery and some credit extension provide some buffer to consumption, household consumption expenditure, which is the highest or the largest contributor to gross domestic product, as honorable members would know. From an investment perspective, the combination of a slightly faster global growth, although there are risks associated with this, which I will come to in my next response, as well as falling interest rates globally, have implications and domestically have implications for investment. And this, of course, is also supported by significant resources being allocated to public infrastructure, which is set out in quite some detail in the budget review. The third question was in relation to risks. What is our view on risks, particularly in relation to AGOA, and have we done any work or analysis of this? In brief, yes, we have. We've done work of this. It isn't currently published in the budget review because our sense is that there are more significant risks from a global growth perspective, which I will speak to now and point honorable members in the right direction to see the results of in the budget review. However, we have done the work on what an exclusion from AGOA might mean, and we're particularly concerned about what it means, especially at sectoral level, because the macroeconomic consequences may mask what this actually means at sectoral level, given the exposure of different products to their participation in the trade agreement. However, that said, we are particularly concerned about risks to global growth more generally, and we provide on page 19 in our scenarios a downside scenario that takes into consideration the impacts of increased geoeconomic fragmentation and what that might mean for economic growth. We see that those risks could subtract from growth in the medium term, but also going into the long term, and will have consequences for South Africa as a small, open economy as we see headwinds from volatility in the trade environment playing out and having impact on our ability to export goods and services, but also to import them, given the importance of imports to economic activity domestically. We provide a detailed write-up of this on page 19, and honorable members are invited to please take a look at this, and if there are any follow-up questions, we're happy to respond in writing if you would get in touch with us. There was a question asked regarding the impact of whether or not we've assessed the impact of a 2% VAT increase on growth, a 0.5% increase on growth, the consequences for inflation, as well as the consequences for economic activity more generally. I won't be able to give you a very detailed summary of all of this. We can have a conversation or engage after, but I will give an overview in the interest of time, but also to ensure that I've answered the question. In brief, yes, we have, and we've done this both off-model and on-model. The results are reflected in the baseline that went out, well, the baseline that would have been published on the 19th, but the embargo on those documents was lifted, so I have no doubt that honorable members have engaged with them, and that gives you a sense. The two transmission mechanisms that we're most concerned about are household consumption expenditure as well as inflation, both of which are presented. We've also presented, in the interest of informing the public and honorable members, a heat map of inflation, and where we see those are the points on inflation in figure 2.4, which is currently on page 17, which gives you a sense of how we're thinking around the core trends underlying inflation, but also how that might move in the as a result of changes to the tax bases in this instance, including VAT. So our outlooks, both on the 19th as well as on the 12th, give a sense of what we think this might mean for growth overall. There were two other questions. The first was in relation to Operation Vulindlela Phase 1. what are the outcomes of it? Has there been any assessment of it? And in brief, yes, there are. There is a closeout report associated with Operation Vulindlela Phase 1, which is available on the Presidency's website, which gives quite a comprehensive rundown of the achievements of Operation Vulindlela Phase 1. And these as well inform some of the institutions thinking around Phase 2 and what those priorities might be. And of course, the chapter 2 of the budget review also gives some sense of Phase 2, its priorities, and our thinking around the potential growth gains in this regard. We also do present a scenario on page 19 as well of what that could mean from a macro fiscal perspective and from an economic growth and resourcing perspective. There was a final question on the 4-pillar growth strategy. Why do we think, well, the question was presented in several ways, and I think in brief, there is no explicit reference to a growth strategy, and I would point honorable members to Chapter 2, as well as Chapter 1 of the budget review, where we speak to these 4 pillars of growth. These matter because in our assessment, not just ours, but the assessment of many economic commentators, the view is that South Africa's got a structural growth problem characterized by falling total factor productivity, and doing these 4 things puts us on a higher and more sustainable growth trajectory because it addresses the fundamental constraints to growth in a way that is sustainable and inclusive. I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. It's Rendania, Acting Head, Public Finance. Let me deal with 3 issues, starting with the spending reviews. Yes, spending reviews have been done, and the low-hanging fruits of these spending reviews have been implemented. I know we've got a session, Honorable Maimane, next week on the 19th, where we're going to be taking you through the spending reviews done. But just to highlight one example of the spending reviews, linking it to your comment on foreign missions. I think we have got about 125 missions, 10 of which have already been closed, and most of them are in South America. But we'll have a session, I know, next week on the 19th, where we're going to be talking about spending reviews. There was a question on National Lotteries Commission, the surplus. Yes, the legal authority flows from Section 53.3 of the PFMA. That says a public entity, Schedule 3, cannot budget for a deficit nor accumulate surpluses without the National Treasury approval. They got a legal opinion to say it's wrong, and our legal team also agrees because that section 53.3, it doesn't differentiate whether you get appropriated funds or you're self-funded. It doesn't differentiate, and NLC is a victim of that. But our legal teams, together with the AG, they are working on it. And lastly, on defense withdrawals, just to note that there are withdrawal costs which are going to be experienced, especially in the first year and second year. But we'll see as soon as the defense implement this exit strategy due to a decision taken yesterday on SADC mission. Thanks.
Okay. Edgar, yes.
Very quickly, thank you. Through you, Chair. There was a question around social grants. Are social grants growing by inflation? Within the budget review, I refer honourable members to Table 5.9, Chapter 5, Table 5.9, which outlines the amounts of the social grants and their increase. They are all growing above inflation. Second question, are there job creation measures in the budget? Table 5.4 of the budget review outlines the job creation funding, amongst other things. In this regard, 75.9 billion rands is allocated to fund this function, including an additional allocation of 4.6 billion rand, which is proposed in the budget the minister tabled on Wednesday. A question around what is the plan to break the debt spiral, figure 1.2 of the budget review, as well as large parts of Chapter 3 outline in detail how the debt trajectory is addressed. The specific strategy focuses on achieving and maintaining a primary fiscal surplus. The reason for this is that given that South Africa's interest on debt is projected to exceed nominal GDP over the medium term, only by maintaining and growing a primary surplus can we hope to stabilize and reduce the debt. The budget therefore proposes a primary fiscal surplus rising to 2 percentage points of GDP in 2027-28. The effect on debt service costs of these proposals within the budget is that debt service costs as a percentage of revenue will peak at 21.7% at the end of this month before declining from next year. This is the effect of the combination of the revenue and spending measures in the budget. There was a question on infrastructure and construction multipliers. Yes, the budget review does contain an analysis of construction multipliers, both from a growth and employment perspective, and these are published in Chapter 2. In addition, Chapter 1, pages 2, 3, and 4, tries to tie together the importance of infrastructure development and the measures contained within the budget. This analysis was also contained within the MTBPS, which was tabled on 31 October 2024 and is updated this week. Finally, there is a question around the threshold for PPPs of 2 billion rand. This is not a qualification threshold for PPPs. It is a threshold for the need to achieve Treasury Regulation 1 and 2 approvals for projects. In other words, a project that is of a value below 2 billion rand does not have to get these approvals. The accounting officer can proceed with the project together with the private party that he or she has identified. Only projects above 2 billion rand have to obtain this approval, thus meaning that projects that are lower than 2 billion can move faster. I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you to the colleagues. Minister, 4 quick additions from my side. The first is that in terms of the questions around pandemic preparedness in Gauteng and the Northwest, the questions around PPPs, that's certainly something we will engage the province on year after. There are certainly some ideas we can share in that case. In terms of the PPPs themselves, however, it's important to make the point that the revisions to Treasury Regulation 16 that were published apply to national departments and entities, not to municipalities. And that's why we are revising the municipal PPP framework during the course of this year. And our view is that will generate a lot of potential for private sector participation in the municipal sphere. Secondly, there were a few questions around the comparator countries used for the tax comparisons. And if the members look at the slides, they will see that, for example, in the case of VAT, we compare ourselves, while we list the OECD average, we compare ourselves to Morocco, Turkey, Algeria, Tunisia, Brazil, India, and Mexico, all of which have higher VAT rates. On the CIT side, we compare ourselves to Africa, and on the PIT side, we also compare ourselves relative to low and middle income countries. So it's important to note there that we do, in fact, ensure that we compare ourselves to our peers in that regard. The third question, much of the work around spending reviews is, in fact, public. On the GTAC website, there's a Knowledge Hub tab. So if members click on the GTAC website and click on the Knowledge Hub tab, they will find much of that work that is there. And as Rendani's indicated, that will also be shared with the committee formally next week. The final set of questions around the GDP forecasts. Are there ever any political pressures to inflate growth? The GDP forecast is a technical process. There are technical teams in the Treasury that run the assumptions process. They go through a very rigorous technical process. That all culminates in a forecast memo that the Minister and I receive. The Minister and I do not participate in that technical process, neither do we change the outcomes of that process. And it's very important to state that very clearly. For the final question, just around the forecast issues, I think Boipuso answered that question exceptionally well, and we are certainly very proud of the work that she and her team does. And let me explain why. Forecasts are not about being right or wrong. Forecasts are fundamentally based on assumptions that are fed into models, and to the extent that those assumptions change, forecasts will be different from reality. The key question is, how do your forecasts compare to those of your peers, and how do they compare to the reality? And as Boypuso has said, in terms of our in-year forecasts, those forecasts are better than our peers. And who are our peers here? Our peers are the Bureau of Economic Research at Stellenbosch, the International Monetary Fund, the South African Reserve Bank, and others. So on an in-year basis, our forecasts are better than our peers. Over the medium term, however, our forecasts are rated as good by independent assessors. And so certainly there's room for improvement there. And Boypuso has spoken about how we ensure that we can make those improvements over time. But also happy to engage with the members to expand a bit more on how our processes work, so that there's a much clearer understanding of how these technical processes run. Thank you, Minister.
Thank you, Honourable Chair, Joint Chairs and members. Firstly, we welcome your visit to SARS. I think it's long outstanding. And then also, I have to say thank you. It's great that all the political parties, all the members supported the additional funding of SARS. So we have to thank you. I'm going to deal with two issues. The one is, we speak a lot about the 800 billion. I want to share with members where that number comes from, and then I will also deal with the issue of wealth tax. You have heard us speak about the 800 billion, and this is what is behind this. But firstly, there's been a number of studies, including the Davis Tax Commission, our own studies and other scholarly studies, that largely confirms with one component of what we include in the 800 billion. Our voluntary compliance at the moment in SARS this year, we've seen quite a significant improvement in percentage points, but even with this year's improvement, it is 65-66%. We'll firm that up when we make our year-end calculations. The tax gap, which is a theoretical study, which includes known and scholarly works. For example, we know that in excise duties, our loss of revenue is about 60 billion. In terms of illicit trade flows, our loss is about 86 billion. And in the last study of the Davis Tax Committee, calculated the largest theoretical loss is on VAT, and that's 195 billion. So, and then you also have aggressive tax planning, issues such as base erosion and transfer pricing, and other ways of masking wealth that goes beyond allowable tax avoidance measures and breaches into what we call tax evasion. So that amount on current values is between 300 and 560 billion rand. Then we have included what we call our balance sheet items, or the stock of uncollected debt, as well as outstanding returns. We have over 54 million outstanding returns over many years, not all of whom we will collect because many things have changed. And then we have on our current debt book of undisputed debt, just over 400 billion rand of undisputed debt. Again, not all of that will be collected. And then we have just over 100 billion of debt that is currently under dispute. So if we add that up, you can see how between 700 and 800 is not an unreasonable amount that we use as a reference. And even if we are 30% successful, we'll still collect over 200 billion rand if we applied ourselves there. And I think that's where we have made the appeal for additional funding. How will the funding be spent to close that gap? For this year, the coming year, 2 billion of the additional 2.5 billion that we'll get for this year will be focused not on closing the tax gap, but on a massive debt recovery program. We have seen this year, and we will announce these results at the end of the year. We about 2.5 weeks away from our financial year end. will give more detail. But we have seen a significant success in how we can have a multiplier to the investment that we've asked the Minister to make. And I think we can share positive results in that regard. Learning from that, we have asked, can we redouble the efforts and spend 2 billion towards the reduction of stock that holds contingent liability for the state. So that's the work we will do in terms of the 200 billion. The 500 million will be used to modernize our systems, because we cannot pursue these areas of abuse without deep investment in technology systems, in the deployment of artificial intelligence, on the automation of routine work, building and increasing our risk detection methodology. Just to give you a sense, using predictive modeling, deployment of AI, we know that there are at least 30,000 individuals who have economic activity of greater than R1 million who are not registered for tax. We know from this work that there are at least 115 million taxpayers, who had 1,000 taxpayers that have previously been marked not required to file, who have in the meantime increased their economic activity, and so they should file, but they are not. And so you can see that the areas of work that we think we need to focus on are known. The capacity to do that work is insignificant or insufficient. So that gives you a sense, and we will later speak more on that, but just to give members a sense of why and how we will deploy the investment to close that gap. On the wealth tax, a lot has been spoken about it. I also think, Chair, this is one of the areas where we may need to come back and do a deep dive discussion with members on wealth tax. Because the first question is, what is a wealth tax? How do we define a tax on the wealthy? There isn't a common definition. Once we have a common definition, then we must identify and find those who we think this wealth tax would be applicable to. Then we have to define, we first have to define the wealthy and then the wealth tax. And then lastly, we have to build the capacity to administer this, because if we don't, inadvertently you will have a worse outcome if you can't administer the policies or the measures that we take. And so that requires a deep amount of work, and it certainly will not bring instant money if we were to do so. But we are not without a wealth tax. Let me share with members the following. At the moment, we have about 48% of the 8,000 of the 8 billion income from tax, from individual taxes. 390 billion of that comes from people who earn over R1 million. So we would say maybe they begin to speak to the wealthy. Almost half of our taxes come from only 570 individuals, 1,000 individuals. And so that's already a tax on wealthy people. That represents 7.2% of individuals who are taxed, but 3.9% of individuals who are employed. Then we have other forms of wealth taxes, including estate duties. When people die, it is biased towards collecting money from the wealthy. Donations tax, equity transfers when people trading in shares, transfer duty, capital gains tax, and property taxes in provinces are all, in local governments, are all forms of wealth tax. And so we're not starting off a blank page when we talk about a wealth tax. What have we done since 2021? We have created a division that looks at what we then took as an initial stab for wealthy, and we started collecting data of all individuals who on registers own more than 50 million of assets. That was our first stab. That revealed to us that there were about 2,800 individuals who would fit that category. And we then also discovered that amongst those individuals, 460 billion of assets are registered as local assets, and about another 150 billion assets are offshore assets, and we know that because of the automatic exchange of information that we get from over 100 countries, and that the tax on their income is about 7 billion rand. So and we are highly undercapacitated. We only have about 80 individuals in a unit that should probably have about 500 people. So that, I thought, is just to give members some idea on how we think about taxing the wealthy. Thank you, Minister. Thank you, Chair.
I think this concludes the responses from the National Treasury. Members, any follow-up that you may want to make, I am going to request that you send it to the National. I'll give you a chance.
Can I make a point, Chair?
Can I?
Yeah, you know, we wait an assumption that we'll be here until 1. We have got to do a similar exercise with NEDLEC. Now, my appeal is that whatever you do, you must take into account now, we've got to join NEDLEC.
What I wanted to say before you came in was to say, members, kindly write your follow-up or clarity-seeking questions. Submit them to the secretaries of your committees, and then it will rightfully be sent to the National Treasury for responses. And members, the joint meeting of Tuesday will be fully virtual, where we'll be engaging with the PBO and the FFC. No hybrid, it's full virtual. And because this brings us to the end of our meeting, let me take this opportunity to really pass my gratitude to the Minister and the team from the National Treasury for really coming before these 4 committees to deliver or to give us a detailed breakdown on the budget that was delivered by the Minister next week. As Honorable Mauto has earlier indicated, it is now upon us as Parliament to make sure that we deal with the process until we are able to convince each other and we reach consensus as legislators. And also, thank you very much to all the members of the 4 committees from both houses and members from provincial legislatures for your participation in this meeting. The 3 chairpersons, thank you very much for being part of this meeting. I think to other stakeholders, the civil society, the media, and the public, you will be informed of the necessary programs that will be upcoming or the activities that will be taken, including the public participation, as I indicated earlier. And it will be done through the committee secretaries. For now, thank you very much and travel safe back home. Thank you. This brings us to the end of the meeting.